The city of Philadelphia woke before its people did cobblestone streets from the 18th century, bearing silent witness to the lives that would unfold across them on this particular Monday morning in late September. In Society Hill, where federal-style brick mansions stood shoulder to shoulder like aging sentinels guarding secrets that money preferred to keep buried, the first light touched leaded glass windows that had watched generations of wealth accumulate and dissipate, according to rhythms ordinary people never quite managed to comprehend. 15 minutes away by car, but separated by chasms that had nothing to do with geography, West Philadelphia stirred with different energy, entirely the kind born from necessity rather than choice, where survival required creativity that prosperity never had to teach. Elena Morrison's alarm didn't sound because she'd been awake for an hour, already staring at the ornate plaster ceiling of her bedroom in the mansion at 412 Delancey Street, counting the seconds between the moment when her mind surfaced from sleep and the moment when reality crashed down with its familiar weight. The nightmare had come again, the same one that visited 3 or 4 times weekly, regardless of how much she tried to exhaust herself before bed, regardless of the sleeping pills her doctor prescribed with increasing concern about dependency, regardless of her desperate bargaining with whatever force controlled the human subconscious. In the dream, Grace called out to her, that sweet voice Elena hadn't heard in 6 years, except in these cruel nocturnal visitations, calling Mommy with all the trust and love a daughter should have for her mother, and Elena would run toward the sound only to wake gasping in the moment before she could reach her child. The clock on her nightstand showed 5:03 in red digits that seemed to pulse with accusation. 47 emails had accumulated since 11 the previous night, when she'd finally surrendered her laptop messages from Tokyo and London and Dubai, because markets never slept. And neither did the machinery of global finance that had made her one of the youngest female billionaires in American history. Morrison Technologies had grown from the startup she and Thomas had built in a rented office 15 years ago into a cybersecurity empire worth $4.2 billion. And with that growth had come responsibilities that consumed every waking hour, and most of the sleeping ones too. The irony wasn't lost on Elena that she'd built a fortune protecting other people's data while being utterly unable to protect the one thing that mattered most. She rose from the king-size bed that felt vast and empty, despite the Egyptian cotton sheets that cost more than most people earned in a month, padding barefoot across Persian carpets worth 6 figures to the window that overlooked Society Hill's geometric perfection. Outside, the streets were empty, except for a single jogger whose dedication to fitness at this ungodly hour spoke to the kind of discipline Elena recognized in herself, the obsessive need to control something when so much else refused to submit to willpower. Red brick facades glowed in the streetlights, each house a monument to accumulated wealth and careful preservation. And somewhere in this sanitized landscape, her daughter slept behind a door Elena was afraid to open because the silence on the other side felt like physical presence that would crush her if given the chance. The ritual had begun 4 years ago this morning, pilgrimage to Grace's door, though Elena could no longer remember if she'd chosen it consciously or if it had simply emerged from the desperate architecture of grief. She moved through the hallway with its gallery of family photographs that documented happier times, Thomas's smile frozen in frames that couldn't capture how his laughter had filled rooms, Grace as an infant and toddler before trauma had stolen her voice. The oak door to her daughter's bedroom was closed as always, and Elena pressed her ear against the wood grain with the same foolish hope that maybe this morning would be different. Maybe she would hear humming or talking to stuffed animals, or even just the sound of restless movement that indicated a child's mind engaging with the world. Silence greeted her, absolute and unforgiving, as always. Grace slept with the stillness of someone who'd learned early that remaining motionless made you invisible to the things that hurt. Elena's hand touched the doorknob, fingers hesitating on the cold brass, wanting to enter, but knowing from experience that waking Grace before her daughter was ready only made the morning harder for both of them. Through the crack beneath the door, she could see no light, and in the darkness, Elena imagined her 6-year-old curled around the brown teddy bear that was Grace's last tangible connection to Thomas the bear her father had given her on what turned out to be his final birthday, 6 weeks before the accident that had ended his life and apparently stolen his daughter's ability to speak. "Stay strong, my little girl. Elena's whisper barely disturbed the air, the words she'd repeated every morning for 6 years feeling increasingly hollow. Today will be different, I believe it will. But even as the promise left her lips, some deeper part of Elena's consciousness recognized the lie for what it was, the desperate fiction she maintained, because admitting defeat felt like betraying both Grace and Thomas's memory simultaneously. The shower ran hot enough to redden skin, Elena standing under the spray and letting the water mask the tears that still came despite her best efforts at the emotional control that had served her so well in boardrooms. She'd learned to cry efficiently, 3 minutes maximum, before the discipline that had built an empire reasserted itself and forced her face into the mask of competence the world expected. By the time she emerged and began the careful application of makeup that turned grief into professionalism, Elena Morrison, the vulnerable mother, had been buried beneath Elena Morrison, the CEO, and only someone who knew where to look would see the hairline cracks in the facade. Coffee waited in the kitchen where Maria Santos had arrived at 5:30, as she had every weekday for the past decade, the housekeeper who'd become more friend than employee, though neither woman acknowledged the shift explicitly. The kitchen was a monument to unused potential professional-grade appliances that rarely operated because Elena survived on takeout, and Maria cooked only for Grace, who ate with the mechanical efficiency of someone for whom food was fuel rather than pleasure. Maria looked up from the breakfast she was preparing for the child, who would descend in 40 minutes with the precision of internal clock that never failed. Buenos dias, señora. Maria's greeting carried the warmth Elena no longer felt capable of generating on her own. The coffee is fresh, and I made that quiche you pretend to enjoy before telling me you're not hungry. Elena managed something that approximated a smile, accepting the cup that Maria pressed into her hands, with the insistence of someone who'd appointed herself guardian of basic human needs. The coffee was perfect because Maria paid attention to details that Elena had stopped noticing, and the gesture felt like kindness that Elena wasn't certain she deserved given how thoroughly she'd failed at the one job that should have mattered more than corporate success. Did you sleep? Maria's question was gentle but direct, the privilege of someone who'd earned the right to ask uncomfortable things through years of loyal service and genuine concern. Elena considered lying but recognized futility. The nightmare came again. Grace calling for me, and I can never reach her before I wake up. She sipped coffee and stared at nothing in particular. 6 years and my subconscious still hasn't accepted that she doesn't talk anymore. Maria set down the knife she'd been using to slice strawberries, wiping her hands on her apron with deliberate slowness that suggested she was choosing her next words carefully. She will speak when she's ready, senora. Children heal in their own time, not ours. The observation was offered without judgment, but Elena heard accusation anyway, the implication that perhaps Grace's continued silence reflected her mother's failure to create conditions where speaking felt safe. I've given her everything. Elena heard the defensive edge in her own voice and hated it. 12 therapists, every specialist on the East Coast, treatments that cost more than most people earn in a year. What else am I supposed to do? Perhaps, Maria suggested quietly, the answer isn't something you can buy. Perhaps it's something you have to give that costs nothing but is harder to provide than money. She returned to the strawberries, letting the observation hang in the air, like smoke that Elena could neither grasp nor dispel. The truth in Maria's words was too painful to examine directly, so Elena retreated into the familiar territory of her phone, scrolling through emails that demanded immediate attention and provided convenient excuse to avoid deeper contemplation. Tokyo was worried about the quarterly projections. London wanted clarification on the acquisition strategy. Dubai had questions about the security protocol implementation. The world kept turning and Elena kept responding because motion felt safer than stillness. And achievement was the one area where her efforts produced measurable results rather than the endless frustration of a daughter who remained locked in silence despite every resource Elena could deploy. 15 minutes away, in an apartment building where paint peeled from exterior walls and the front steps required careful navigation to avoid the crack that had been there since Marcus Hayes first moved in 7 years ago, morning arrived with entirely different character. The sun hadn't yet crested the roofline when Marcus woke to his phone's alarm, the cheerful chime he'd selected because Caleb had once told him that starting the day with something happy made the hard parts easier to handle. For 3 seconds, Marcus floated in that blessed space between sleep and full consciousness, the moment before memory reasserted itself, and reminded him that Rachel was gone and would remain gone regardless of how many mornings he woke hoping to find her beside him. The ceiling above his bed bore a water stain shaped vaguely like Ohio, and Marcus had spent enough mornings staring at that irregular brown bloom to have mapped its contours with the precision of cartographer. 7 years since Rachel's death, and he'd stopped waiting for the grief to diminish, had instead learned to carry it like chronic condition that flared unpredictably, regardless of how carefully he managed his emotional landscape. Some days the weight was bearable, and he could almost convince himself he was functioning normally. Other days, like this particular Monday morning, the absence pressed against his chest with force that made breathing feel like conscious decision rather than automatic process. Rise and shine, champion. Marcus pushed himself vertical, despite his body's protest padding down the narrow hallway to the room where Caleb slept with the abandon of 12-year-old who hadn't yet learned that the world was designed to disappoint. The boy was sprawled across his bed in posture that defied physics, one leg hanging off the mattress and his pillow somewhere on the floor, and Marcus felt the familiar surge of love mixed with terror that parenthood seemed to generate in equal measure. He'd been given custody of this beautiful, complicated child, and some days the responsibility felt like honor, while other days it felt like cosmic joke given how thoroughly Marcus had failed to save the person Caleb had needed most. Come on, buddy. Smell that. That's Dad's famous pancakes calling your name. Marcus touched his son's shoulder gently, watching Caleb's face scrunch before his eyes opened to reveal the same dark eyes Rachel had possessed, the genetic legacy that made Marcus's heart ache and sing simultaneously every time he looked at his son. Caleb stretched with sound that was half groan and half yawn, consciousness returning in stages. Dad, you always say your pancakes are famous, but you only ever make them for me. How can they be famous if nobody else has tried them? The logic was characteristic of Caleb's developing adolescent mind, the tendency to poke holes in adult assertions that Marcus found simultaneously frustrating and delightful. Exactly. Marcus grinned despite the early hour and the long shift ahead. That's what makes you the luckiest kid in Philadelphia. You get exclusive access to culinary masterpiece that the masses will never appreciate. Now move it before the batter gets lonely without you. They assembled in the kitchen that was really just an alcove with pretensions, the space barely large enough for two people to maneuver, without bumping elbows, but the proximity felt like intimacy rather than constraint. Marcus had learned to cook by necessity after Rachel's death, starting with burned eggs and graduating slowly to meals that were edible if not inspired. And the morning pancake ritual had become their shared ceremony that marked new beginnings regardless of how the previous day had ended. The table was scarred wood that had probably been in the apartment when Marcus moved in, and the chairs didn't match because he'd acquired them from different yard sales over the years. But the space was theirs, and that mattered more than aesthetic coherence. Monday, Marcus flipped pancakes with practiced motion while Caleb set out plates and syrup. You know what I always say about Mondays, a new week, new opportunities. Caleb recited the phrase with the long-suffering patience of someone who'd heard it approximately 500 times, but Marcus caught the hint of smile that suggested his son appreciated the ritual, even while pretending to find it tiresome. That's my boy. Marcus slid 3 pancakes onto Caleb's plate and watched his son drench them in syrup with the enthusiasm of someone whose metabolism could still handle that much sugar without consequences. They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes, the kind that only came from years of learning each other's rhythms, before Caleb set down his fork with the deliberateness that indicated serious conversation approaching. Dad, Caleb's voice carried careful neutrality that immediately put Marcus on alert. Yesterday at school, Johnny Ramirez asked me why you don't work in an office like other dads. He said his dad wears a suit and has meetings downtown and makes a lot of money. The observation was delivered without obvious judgment, but Marcus heard the question underneath the 12-year-old's growing awareness of class differences and where his family fit in the economic hierarchy. Marcus set down his own fork, turning to give Caleb full attention, because this was exactly the kind of moment that could shape a child's understanding of worth and dignity, and he'd be damned if his son internalized the message that a person's value was measured by their paycheck. What did you tell Johnny? I told him. Caleb's voice strengthened with conviction that made Marcus's throat tight. I told him my dad is the strongest man I know, and strong people do whatever it takes to take care of their family. I told him Johnny might have a dad in a suit, but that dad definitely doesn't know how to make pancakes that taste like happiness. The phrase hit Marcus like physical impact, the casual poetry of childhood wisdom, cutting through his own insecurities with surgical precision. He turned away ostensibly to pour more coffee, but really to hide the moisture gathering in his eyes, the sudden overwhelming love for this child who saw him clearly and chose to celebrate rather than criticize what he found. You really think that his voice came out rougher than intended? You really think I'm strong? Caleb's response was immediate and absolute. I think Johnny's dad might wear expensive suits and have a fancy office, but he works so much that Johnny eats dinner alone most nights. He paused for emphasis. And I think being strong isn't about how much money you make. It's about showing up. You've shown up every single day since Mom died, Dad. That's strength. Marcus returned to the table and wrapped his son in a hug that probably lasted longer than Caleb preferred, but which Marcus needed desperately, this physical confirmation that despite all his failures and limitations, he'd managed to do at least one thing right in raising a child who understood that wealth and worth weren't synonyms. When he finally released Caleb and they returned to breakfast, the pancakes had gone cold, but neither of them cared because some moments were more important than perfect temperature. The contrast between the Morrison mansion and the Hayes apartment extended beyond architectural grandeur into the very texture of morning routine. Elena moved through her home with the efficiency of general commanding troops, every action calculated to maximize productivity and minimize wasted time, while Marcus and Caleb navigated their smaller space with the easy familiarity of people who'd learned to find grace in constraint. But both households shared an underlying current of grief that colored even ordinary moments, the awareness of absence that no amount of money or love could fully address. Elena's morning schedule was choreographed with precision that would have impressed military planners. 7:15 meant collecting Grace for the drive to St. Joseph's Private School, the institution where tuition costs $45,000 annual. All in, supposedly provided the best education money could buy, though Elena had begun to suspect that no amount of expensive instruction could compensate for the emotional isolation that came from being the only child in class who never spoke. Grace descended the stairs at exactly 7:17, her internal clock never varying by more than a minute, dressed in the uniform that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and clutching the brown teddy bear she refused to leave home without. "Good morning, sweetheart." Elena kept her voice cheerful, despite knowing Grace wouldn't respond verbally, settling for the small smile her daughter offered in return. Ready for school, Grace nodded once the economical gesture that conveyed agreement without requiring the vulnerability of speech. "Did you sleep well?" Another nod, though Elena suspected this was more politeness than truth. Given the shadows under her daughter's eyes that suggested rest remained as elusive for Grace as it did for Elena. The drive to St. Joseph's took them through Philadelphia's morning traffic, Elena's Bentley navigating streets with the smooth silence that extreme engineering provided. In the bulletproof glass that separated them from the outside world, Elena watched her daughter's reflection, seeing Grace's fingers move in constant motion against the teddy bear's worn fur. The self-soothing gesture that Dr. Park had explained was common in children with selective mutism. The psychologist had used words like trauma response and anxiety disorder, and explained that Grace's silence wasn't willful defiance, but rather a psychological manifestation of overwhelm that made speech physically impossible in most contexts. Elena had listened to the explanation and understood it intellectually, while emotionally still feeling like her daughter's refusal to speak was somehow her fault punishment for failing to prevent the accident that had stolen Thomas and apparently Grace's voice along with Hashim. They arrived at St. Joseph's at 7:45, early enough that only a handful of other students had been dropped off, and Elena watched through the windshield as Grace walked toward the building with her characteristic combination of perfect posture and complete isolation. Other children arrived in groups laughing and talking and displaying the easy socialization that should have been Grace's birthright, while Elena's daughter moved through them like ghosts passing through walls, acknowledged but not truly seen. One girl approached someone Elena recognized from previous observations, though she'd never learned the child's name, and attempted to engage Grace in conversation. Her daughter smiled and nodded in response but didn't speak, and after 30 seconds of one-sided interaction, the other girl gave up and moved on to find someone capable of actual dialogue. Elena's chest constricted watching this small rejection play out, knowing it was one of dozens Grace experienced daily, the slow accumulation of social isolation that came from being unable or unwilling to participate in the verbal currency that children use to build relationships. She wanted to intervene to explain to the other students that Grace wasn't being rude or stuck up, but was struggling with psychological condition that made speaking feel impossible. But Dr. Park had been explicit that overprotection would only reinforce Grace's anxiety rather than helping her overcome it. So Elena sat in her luxury vehicle and watched her daughter disappear into the building alone, feeling more helpless than any amount of wealth or power could address. The phone in her lap buzzed with incoming call from her CFO, pulling Elena back into the professional realm, where she actually possessed competence and control. She answered with the brisk efficiency that characterized her business persona, listening to concerns about the Tokyo projections while simultaneously pulling back into traffic and mentally shifting gears from worried mother to corporate executive. The compartmentalization had become second nature over the years, the ability to wall off personal anguish and function at high level professionally, though some days Elena wondered what the cost of that division might be, and whether she'd ever be able to reclaim the integrated self she'd been before tragedy had forced her to fragment. Marcus's morning commute followed different rhythm entirely, his pickup truck coughing to life with the reluctance of vehicle that had seen better decades and was held together more by prayer than proper maintenance. The radio played Stevie Wonder because Marcus believed in starting the day with music that celebrated rather than complained, and he sang along to Isn't She Lovely while navigating toward the sanitation department depot on the west side, his voice carrying the unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone who'd long ago abandoned caring whether he could carry a tune. The truck's heater worked intermittently at best, and Marcus had learned to dress in layers during Philadelphia's autumn months when morning temperatures hovered in the 40s before climbing to the 60s by afternoon. The depot hummed with activity when Marcus arrived at 6:45, the pre-dawn gathering of the city's invisible workforce, the men and women who performed the essential labor that kept Philadelphia functioning while remaining largely unnoticed by the people whose trash they collected. Marcus had been on the sanitation crew for 7 years now, taking the job after leaving emergency medical services in the wake of Rachel's death and the guilt that had made continuing as EMT psychologically untenable. The work was physical and repetitive and paid considerably less than his previous career, but it offered something Marcus needed more than money: the ability to complete visible tasks, where success was measurable in emptied bins rather than the ambiguous outcomes of emergency medicine, where your best efforts sometimes weren't enough. Morning, Marcus. Joe Patterson raised a hand in greeting the 60-year-old coworker who'd become something like friend over the years, through the easy familiarity that came from shared labor. His face bore the weathering of someone who'd spent 4 decades working outdoors, and his hands showed the scarring that came from thousands of bags and bins handled without complaint. You're early, trying to impress the boss, or just couldn't sleep again? Early bird finds trash early. Marcus grinned, reaching for the thermos of coffee he'd brought because the depot's brew tasted like punishment. How's Martha doing? Last week you mentioned her arthritis was getting worse. The question was genuine, not mere politeness, because Marcus had learned from Father O'Brien at St. Patrick's Cathedral that community was built through attention to the details of other people's struggles. And after Rachel's death, the only thing that had kept Marcus functional was the community that had surrounded him with practical support and genuine caring. Joe's expression softened with gratitude for being asked. Doctor says she needs knee replacement surgery, but you know how it is. Insurance will only cover part of it, and we don't have the savings for the rest. She's stubborn, though, won't complain about the pain, even when I can see her struggling to stand. His voice carried the helpless frustration of someone who wanted to fix things for a person he loved, but lacked the resources to do so. Tell her I'll stop by this weekend. Marcus made the offer automatically, already calculating how he could help, without making it feel like charity that would wound Joe's pride. Caleb's been wanting to learn some gardening, and Martha knows everything about growing vegetables in urban spaces. Maybe she could teach him some basics while I help with whatever heavy work needs doing around your place. Joe's eyes grew suspicious with emotion. He blinked away before it could fully form. You've got enough on your plate already, Marcus. Don't need to be taking on other people's problems too. That's exactly when you need to. Marcus checked the truck's assignment sheet, noting they'd be working Society Hill today, the route he both appreciated for its well-maintained infrastructure and found vaguely unsettling for the wealth it represented. The more loaded your plate is, the more important it becomes to help others. Otherwise, we're all just struggling alone instead of struggling together, and that's not what community means. The observation seemed to resonate with Joe, who nodded slowly before moving to his own vehicle. "You're a good man, Marcus Hayes. Better than most of us deserve to have on this crew." The compliment was delivered with the gruff embarrassment of someone unused to expressing affection directly, and Marcus accepted it in the spirit offered, recognizing that the bonds formed through shared labor were often stronger than relationships built through leisure, because adversity revealed character in ways comfort never could. Father O'Brien would probably call it grace. Marcus started his truck's engine listening to it sputter before catching. "I just call it trying to be human in a world that makes it easy to forget how." He pulled out of the depot and into Philadelphia's awakening streets, the city transforming from sleeping to active as businesses opened and commuters flooded the roadways, and Marcus felt the familiar centering that came from having clear purpose, even if that purpose was something as humble as collecting garbage that other people didn't want to think about. The sanitation route through Society Hill always made Marcus uncomfortable in ways he'd never quite articulated, some combination of class resentment and aesthetic appreciation that left him feeling simultaneously angry about the concentration of wealth and impressed by the architectural beauty that money could preserve. The houses here dated back to the 1700s, red brick facades and shuttered windows, and the kind of historical significance that commanded premium prices from people who wanted to live surrounded by the physical manifestations of American history. The streets were clean in ways that West Philadelphia's never quite managed to be, and the trash Marcus collected from these homes reflected consumption patterns that spoke to privilege he'd never experienced and probably never would. At 8:15, Marcus's truck turned onto Delancey Street, the cobblestones making his vehicle bounce in ways that reminded him the suspension needed work he couldn't afford, and he noted the house numbers climbing toward 400 as he moved deeper into the neighborhood's heart. 412 appeared on his right, a three-story mansion with black iron gates and gardens that probably cost more to maintain monthly than Marcus earned in the same period. The trash bins were already positioned at the curb with the precision that characterized this neighborhood, where even garbage placement seemed subject to aesthetic considerations, and Marcus maneuvered his truck to collect them with the practiced efficiency that came from performing the same actions thousands of times. He'd heard coworkers mention this particular address, the casual gossip that circulated among people who worked routes regularly and noticed patterns in the homes they serviced. The youngest female billionaire in Pennsylvania lived here, someone had said, raising her daughter alone after her husband died in some kind of accident. The child had been damaged by the trauma, they said hadn't spoken since her father's death, and the mother threw money at the problem while remaining emotionally absent herself. Marcus had listened to these characterizations with the skepticism of someone who'd learned that the stories people told about others revealed more about the teller than the subject, but he'd also noticed certain details that suggested truth beneath the speculation. The trash from 412 always included an unusual number of therapy-related materials, treatment plans, and psychological assessment reports that should have been shredded for privacy, but sometimes ended up whole in the recycling, and the patterns spoke to someone spending enormous resources trying to help a child who remained resistant to improvement. Weird nickname for a kid. Marcus spoke to himself as he hauled the bins toward his truck's mechanism. The mute angel, they call her. Every child should be noisy and messy. That's what being a kid is supposed to mean. The observation carried the weight of his own parenting philosophy, built partly from instinct and partly from the counsel of people like Father O'Brien, who reminded Marcus that children needed space to be imperfect rather than pressure to perform perfectly. A small sound interrupted his reflection, barely audible above the ambient noise of morning traffic and distant sirens, and Marcus turned toward its source with the instinctive attention of someone trained to notice subtle signals that might indicate distress. Behind the iron bars of 412's gate stood a little girl who matched the descriptions he'd heard, maybe 6 years old, with golden hair, pulled back in neat braids, and blue eyes that were the particular shade of expensive pool water that Marcus had only ever seen in wealthy neighborhoods. She wore a pink dress that probably cost more than his weekly salary, but the sadness in her expression was universal and transcended any price tag, the particular grief of childhood that Marcus recognized because he'd watched Caleb wear it for 2 years after Rachel died. The girl's hand pointed towards something, and Marcus followed her gesture to where a brown teddy bear lay crushed among the trash bags that had already been loaded into his truck. The bear looked well-loved rather than discarded, the kind of object that acquired value through emotional investment rather than monetary cost. And Marcus immediately understood that this wasn't intentional disposal, but rather accident that needed correcting before it became permanent loss. Oh no. Marcus set down the bin he'd been holding, approaching the gate with the deliberate slowness of someone who didn't want to frighten a child already displaying signs of distress. Is that your bear? The question was gentle pitched to convey concern rather than judgment, and the girl nodded vigorously while her eyes filled with tears that threatened to spill over her cheeks. Marcus retrieved the bear from his truck, brushing off the debris that clung to its worn fur, and examining it with the careful attention one might give to valuable artifact. The bear had clearly been important to someone for a long time, the kind of beloved object that accumulated years of comfort and association, and Marcus handled it with the respect such things deserved. He approached the gate and carefully pushed the bear through the bars, watching the girl's face transform from despair to relief as she accepted the returned treasure and clutched it to her chest with the fierce gratitude of someone who'd thought something precious was lost forever. What's his name? Marcus crouched to her eye level, recognizing that conversations with children worked better when you met them where they were, rather than looming over them from adult height. The girl's lips parted as if to answer before closing again without sound, and Marcus saw understanding dawn about her condition, the selective mutism that apparently rendered her incapable of speech despite obvious desire to communicate. That's okay, you don't have to say it. He kept his voice warm and accepting, wanting her to know that silence was allowed, rather than something requiring apology. I can tell he's very special just by looking at how soft he is and how neat his bow tie is. He must have quite a story having adventures with you. The girl nodded enthusiastically, her whole body seeming to relax now that the bear was safely returned, and this strange adult wasn't demanding verbal response she couldn't provide. Marcus found himself smiling at her expressiveness, the way she communicated volumes through gesture and facial expression, even while remaining silent, and something about her reminded him of Caleb during those dark months after Rachel's death, when his son had withdrawn into similar protective muteness. You know what? Marcus settled more comfortably into his crouch, recognizing this moment as something more significant than simple lost and found transaction. My son Caleb has a bear just like yours. Maybe they're distant cousins or something. Every night before bed, Caleb tells his bear stories about school and his dreams, and sometimes about missing his mom. He paused to let that sink in before continuing. Talking to a bear is easier than talking to people sometimes, because bears don't judge or interrupt. They just listen. That's their special power, really. They know how to listen better than most people ever learn to. The observation seemed to resonate with the girl, whose eyes widened with recognition of someone who understood the value of listeners rather than speakers. She pointed at Marcus, then at herself, then hugged her bear tightly, in gesture that Marcus interpreted as questioning whether bears could provide the same comfort for everyone regardless of their specific circumstances. Absolutely. Marcus nodded with conviction he genuinely felt. And you know what else bears are good at? They give the best hugs because they hold all the feelings you're not ready to share yet. They keep your words safe until you're ready to let them out. Someday when you feel like talking, your bear there will give all those stored up words back to you. But there's no rush. Words will wait as long as they need to. For the first time in what Marcus suspected was a very long while, based on what he'd heard about this child, the girl smiled. It was small and tentative, the kind of expression that suggested the facial muscles had forgotten how to form that particular configuration from lack of practice, but it was genuine rather than forced, and it transformed her face from sad to something approaching hopeful. Marcus felt warmth in his chest, seeing that smile, the particular satisfaction that came from connecting with someone struggling, and he recognized that this moment mattered in ways that extended beyond the simple mechanics of returning a lost possession. I have to keep working now. Marcus stood reluctantly, aware that he had a schedule to maintain and a route to finish before afternoon. But I'll be back tomorrow, same time. Maybe you could introduce me to your bear properly then. Maybe he'll have new stories to share about the adventures you two have together. The invitation was deliberately low pressure, offering future connection without demanding anything in return, and the girl nodded eagerly before waving her small hand in farewell. Marcus returned to his truck with the strange sensation of having participated in something meaningful, despite its apparent simplicity, and as he continued down Delancey Street, collecting bins and emptying them into his vehicle, his mind kept returning to the image of that little girl clutching her rescued bear like it was the most valuable thing in the world. In a neighborhood where wealth was measured in millions and display was everything, she'd found comfort in a worn stuffed animal that was literally being thrown away. And that juxtaposition felt like commentary on something Marcus couldn't quite articulate, but understood instinctively mattered. What he didn't know, couldn't have known from his position on the street, was that Elena Morrison had been watching the entire interaction from her second-floor study, where she'd retreated after dropping Grace at school to handle the morning's emergency calls before her first scheduled meeting. She'd been halfway through a conversation with Tokyo when movement in the front garden caught her peripheral vision, and what she'd seen had made her interrupt the CFO mid-sentence to rush to the window with heart suddenly pounding hard enough to feel in her throat. Grace was outside alone, something that never happened, standing at the gate and interacting with a stranger, which violated every security protocol Elena had established. The first rush of panic was quickly followed by confusion as Elena processed the scene unfolding below. The stranger was clearly the garbage collector based on his orange uniform and the truck bearing the city sanitation department's logo. And he was crouching at Grace's level, having what appeared to be an actual conversation despite the fact that Elena knew her daughter couldn't respond verbally. More impossibly still, Grace was smiling that genuine expression of happiness that Elena hadn't seen in so long she'd almost forgotten what it looked like on her daughter's face. "Oh my God." Elena's whisper barely disturbed the air in her study, both hands pressed against the window glass as she watched this stranger accomplish, in 3 minutes, what 12 therapists and countless expensive interventions had failed to achieve over 6 years. He's making her smile. Her voice cracked on the last word, tears she hadn't anticipated, suddenly streaming down her face, the overwhelming rush of emotion that came from seeing evidence that her daughter was still capable of joy, even if Elena herself seemed unable to provide it. The garbage collector stood and said something else that Elena couldn't hear through the double-pane windows, and Grace nodded enthusiastically before waving goodbye as he returned to his truck. Elena watched him continue down the street with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd performed these same actions countless times, and she remained at the window long after he disappeared around the corner, trying to process what she'd witnessed and what it meant about her own failures as a mother, that a complete stranger could connect with her daughter in ways she couldn't. Maria appeared in the study doorway, her expression concerned. "Senora Elena, your meeting with the board starts in 10 minutes and you're still in yesterday's clothes. Is everything all right?" The question was gentle but pointed, Maria's way of indicating that Elena had clearly been so distracted she'd forgotten basic functions like sleeping or changing. "I just watched Grace smile." Elena spoke without turning from the window, her voice carrying the particular wonder of someone describing miracle. Some man, the garbage collector, gave her back her bear that had gotten mixed in with the trash, and he talked to her for maybe 3 minutes. "Just 3 minutes, Maria." And she smiled, actually smiled. Not that polite thing she does when people demand it from her, but a real smile like she used to give Thomas before everything went wrong. Maria crossed to stand beside her employer, following Elena's gaze to the empty street where this interaction had apparently occurred. "That is a gift, Senora, to make a sad child smile even briefly. Perhaps this man has wisdom that expensive doctors do not. Or perhaps," Elena's voice turned bitter with self-recrimination, "perhaps my daughter responds better to strangers than to her own mother because I've failed her so completely that anyone else is an improvement." The observation was cruel toward herself, but felt deserved the accumulated weight of 6 years of unsuccessful attempts to reach Grace, crushing down with renewed force in the wake of watching someone else succeed so easily. "That is not true, and you know it." Maria's reproof was firm, without being harsh. "You love your daughter. Sometimes love is not enough by itself, but that does not mean it is worthless or that you have failed. Perhaps this man simply offered what Grace needed in this particular moment, and perhaps tomorrow she will need something different that only you can provide. Children are not puzzles to be solved with single answers, Senora. They are people who need different things at different times." The words were meant as comfort, but Elena wasn't ready to be comforted, still too raw from the shock of watching her daughter connect with someone else so effortlessly while remaining locked behind walls Elena couldn't breach. She needed to understand who this person was, what he'd said, whether this was some kind of anomaly or if it represented possibility for genuine progress toward helping Grace heal. The board meeting could wait or could be rescheduled entirely because nothing in the corporate realm mattered as much as the glimpse she just witnessed of her daughter experiencing something other than grief-locked silence. I need to know who he is. Elena's decision was immediate and absolute. Call the sanitation department. Find out which collector services this route and get me his employment records. Background check everything. I need to understand what just happened and whether this is something I can replicate or if it was just random chance that means nothing. Maria hesitated, the unusual reluctance suggesting she had reservations about this course of action. Senora, perhaps it would be better to simply be grateful for the moment and see if it happens again naturally. If you begin investigating this man and trying to engineer more interactions, you risk turning something pure into something calculated. Sometimes the magic is in the spontaneity rather than the planning. But Elena was already reaching for her phone, the same drive that had built a billion-dollar empire, now focused on solving the puzzle of what had made her daughter smile, and spontaneity felt like luxury she couldn't afford when Grace's well-being hung in the balance. Everything in Elena's life had been optimized and planned because that was how success was achieved, and she saw no reason why parenting should operate according to different principles, when the same analytical approach that worked in business should logically transfer to personal challenges. The call to the sanitation department was answered by someone who sounded simultaneously bored and defensive, the particular combination that came from working customer service for an underfunded city agency. Elena deployed her most authoritative tone, the voice that made subordinates jump and investors reconsider their positions, demanding information about the collector who serviced Delancey Street on Monday mornings. There was resistance initially, privacy policies and union regulations creating bureaucratic barriers, but Elena had learned long ago that persistence combined with implied threat usually broke through such obstacles given sufficient pressure. What she learned was simultaneously reassuring and mysterious. Marcus Hayes, 42 years old, had worked for the sanitation department for 7 years with spotless record. Never late, never complained, consistently received positive feedback from the limited performance reviews that public sector employment bothered to conduct. Before sanitation, he'd worked as EMT, but had left that career under circumstances that weren't specified in his current employment file. He had a 12-year-old son and apparently no other family in the Philadelphia area that the department knew or issue of. The information was factual and unrevealing, offering no insight into why this particular person had connected with Grace when so many others had failed. Elena thanked the supervisor and ended the call, staring at the name she'd written on her notepad, with the unsettling recognition that she now knew more about this stranger than felt entirely appropriate, given their complete lack of actual relationship. Marcus Hayes. The name felt ordinary, the kind of designation that belonged to millions of American men and carried no particular distinction. Yet this ordinary man with his ordinary name had accomplished something extraordinary in those 3 minutes at her gate, and Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she'd witnessed the beginning of something significant, even if she couldn't yet articulate what that significance might mean. The week proceeded with the relentless momentum that characterized Elena's existence, meetings and strategy sessions, and the 1,000 demands that came with running a company whose valuation was measured in billions. But beneath the surface competence and strategic thinking, her attention remained partially focused on the question of Marcus Hayes and whether his interaction with Grace had been meaningful connection or random chance that meant nothing beyond the momentary smile it had produced. She found herself checking the window on Tuesday morning, watching for the green sanitation truck, even while telling herself that this was ridiculous behavior for a CEO whose time was worth thousands of dollars per hour. The truck appeared at 8:16, 1 minute later than Monday, but close enough to suggest consistent routine, and Elena's chest tightened, watching Marcus Hayes emerge and approach her property's trash bins with the same methodical efficiency he'd displayed previously. Grace wasn't visible anywhere safely at school where she belonged, and Elena felt simultaneous relief and disappointment that there would be no repeat of yesterday's interaction. Yet as Marcus worked his way through the collection process, Elena noticed him glance toward the gate with expression that might have been disappointment, and she realized with start that he'd been hoping to see Grace again, just as the little girl had probably been hoping to see him. By Wednesday, the pattern had clarified itself with the precision that came from repeated observation. Marcus arrived at approximately 8:15, collected the bins, and always paused to look toward the house, as if checking whether the little girl might appear. Grace was never there because school started at 8, and Elena's schedule demanded they leave by 7:30, but Elena found herself documenting these small gestures of attention in the mental ledger she was building about this man who'd somehow become person of interest despite their complete lack of direct interaction. Thursday brought change that Elena hadn't anticipated, the kind of development that demonstrated she'd been operating under insufficient information about her own daughter's internal world. She was in her study handling yet another crisis from the Tokyo office when Maria's voice came through the intercom with unusual urgency, the tone that suggested something requiring immediate attention had occurred downstairs. Elena's first thought was intruder or injury, the catastrophic possibilities that every parent maintained in mental inventory, and she took the stairs at nearly a run while her heart hammered with adrenaline-fueled terror. What she found was Grace standing at the living room window that overlooked the front garden, her face pressed against the glass and her eyes tracking something in the street with the focused intensity that Elena rarely saw her daughter direct toward anything. Following Grace's gaze, Elena saw the green sanitation truck and understood immediately what had captured her daughter's attention. The little girl was waiting, watching for Marcus Hayes with the same anticipation Elena had been feeling, and the recognition that Grace was actively seeking this connection rather than just responding to it when offered shifted something fundamental in Elena's understanding of what was happening. Elena's hand moved instinctively toward the intercom to summon Maria before freezing in mid-reach as she processed what this moment actually represented. Grace was exhibiting agency for the first time in memory, actively seeking connection rather than passively accepting or rejecting what others offered, and interrupting that felt like exactly the kind of controlling behavior that had probably contributed to her daughter's withdrawal in the first place. So Elena stood motionless in the hallway, watching her 6-year-old watch a garbage truck, feeling the particular helplessness of recognizing that sometimes the most important parenting decision was choosing not to intervene even when every instinct screamed otherwise. The truck rolled away down Delancey Street, and Grace remained at the window for another 3 minutes, her small hand pressed against the glass in farewell gesture that made Elena's throat constrict with emotion she couldn't quite name. When her daughter finally turned away from the window, the disappointment was visible in the slump of her shoulders, and Elena retreated to the stairs before Grace could catch her observing some instinct suggesting that this moment needed to remain private, rather than becoming something her mother acknowledged and thereby transformed into different experience entirely. Friday morning, Elena made a decision that would have shocked her board of directors had they known about it, canceling her 8 o'clock meeting with London and positioning herself in the front sitting room where she could observe the street without being immediately visible to anyone outside. The justification she offered herself was that understanding Grace's therapeutic needs required direct observation of what actually helped versus what experts theorized might help. But underneath the rationalization was simpler truth that Elena couldn't quite admit. She wanted to see for herself what made her daughter respond to this stranger in ways she'd never responded to anyone else. At 7:45, Grace appeared at the front door dressed for school but carrying her backpack with unusual purposefulness. And before Elena could intercept her, the little girl had slipped outside into the garden and positioned herself at the gate with the clear intention of waiting. The sight made Elena's chest tighten because Grace had never displayed this kind of initiative, had spent 6 years being moved through life like passenger rather than driver, and watching her actively pursue something she wanted felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying in ways Elena couldn't quite articulate. The sanitation truck arrived at 8:17, and Marcus emerged with the same efficient movements Elena had observed all week. But this time his face transformed the moment he spotted Grace waiting at the gate. The smile that spread across his features was unrehearsed and genuine, carrying none of the performative quality that characterized most adult interactions with children, and Elena watched her daughter's face mirror that expression with the unconscious mimicry that spoke to real connection rather than polite compliance. "Good morning, Princess." Marcus's voice carried clearly through the autumn air, warm with genuine pleasure at seeing her again. "I was hoping you'd be here. Did your bear have a good week?" Grace nodded enthusiastically, holding up the teddy bear for his inspection, and Marcus made a show of examining it carefully. "He looks very well rested. You must be taking excellent care of him." Elena couldn't hear Grace's response because there wasn't one the familiar silence that had defined her daughter's existence for 6 years But Marcus didn't seem bothered by the lack of verbal communication. Instead, he crouched to Grace's level and began telling her about his own week, about Caleb's basketball practice, and the neighbor's cat that kept visiting their apartment, ordinary details that somehow became engaging through the animated way he described them. Grace listened with the focused attention she rarely gave anyone, and Elena watched her daughter's face cycle through expressions that mapped to Marcus's narrative delight and concern and curiosity, flowing naturally in ways that suggested she was fully present in the conversation, despite not contributing words to it. You know what Caleb told me yesterday? Marcus's tone shifted to something more serious, the kind of voice adults use when sharing important truths with children. He said that his favorite thing about our apartment isn't the space or the neighborhood or any of the physical stuff. His favorite thing is that it feels safe. Not safe like protected from danger, but safe like he can be sad when he needs to be sad and happy when he needs to be happy, and nobody tells him he has to feel different than what he actually feels. The observation landed with Elena like physical impact, the implicit criticism of her own approach to Grace's grief cutting through her defensive barriers with surgical precision. She'd spent 6 years trying to fix her daughter's sadness, deploying experts and interventions, in the assumption that the right treatment would restore Grace to the happy child she'd been before Thomas died. But Marcus was suggesting that maybe sadness didn't need fixing, that maybe creating space for grief to exist was more valuable than attempting to eliminate it. Grace's hand reached through the bars of the gate, a gesture Elena had never seen her make before, and Marcus accepted her small fingers in his larger hand with the gentleness of someone who understood that trust was fragile and needed to be honored rather than exploited. They stood like that for perhaps 30 seconds, connected through iron bars, while morning traffic flowed past and the city continued its relentless forward motion, and Elena felt herself witnessing something sacred that she had no right to interrupt or intrude upon. I have to finish my route now. Marcus released Grace's hand with obvious reluctance. But I'll be back Monday, same time. Maybe by then you'll have new stories to share about adventures you and your bear had over the weekend. Grace nodded and waved, and Elena watched her daughter remain at the gate until the truck disappeared around the corner, before finally turning back toward the house with expression that was equal parts contentment and melancholy. The weekend stretched before Elena with the particular weight of unstructured time that she'd never learned to navigate comfortably, hours that needed to be filled with activities that justified their passage rather than simply experienced for their own sake. She took Grace to the Please Touch Museum on Saturday, the children's space that was supposed to encourage interactive learning through play, and watched her daughter move through the exhibits with the same polite detachment she brought to everything. Other children shrieked with joy and argued over toys and displayed the messy enthusiasm that childhood was supposed to contain, while Grace observed from careful distance like anthropologists studying foreign culture she had no intention of joining. Sunday brought the ritual visit to St. Peter's Cemetery, where Thomas was buried, the weekly pilgrimage that Elena maintained partly from genuine desire to feel connected to her late husband, and partly from the sense that abandoning this practice would constitute some kind of final acceptance of his death that she wasn't ready to grant. Grace came willingly, as always, settling herself cross-legged on the grass beside the headstone, with her teddy bear positioned carefully in her lap, and Elena watched her daughter's lips move in the silent conversation she apparently conducted with her father, despite the fact that Thomas couldn't respond any more than living people could coax speech from her. The drive home took them through West Philadelphia, a route Elena normally avoided because the visible poverty made her uncomfortable in ways she preferred not to examine, but construction had closed her usual path and the detour became mandatory. The neighborhood spoke to different economic reality than Society Hill's carefully preserved wealth buildings that needed paint they wouldn't receive, and infrastructure that had been neglected past the point where simple maintenance could address the accumulated damage. Children played in streets that weren't safe, and Elena found herself gripping the steering wheel tighter, while some instinctive part of her consciousness calculated the distance between her own privilege and the struggles visible through her windshield. A pickup truck parked outside the apartment building caught her attention, something familiar about its particular combination of rust and determination registering before her conscious mind identified the connection. The sanitation department's logo was barely visible under layers of grime on the door, and as Elena slowed to navigate around another vehicle, she saw Marcus emerging from the building with a boy who had to be Caleb based on his age and the easy familiarity between them. Father and son were laughing about something their whole bodies animated with shared joy, and the contrast between their obvious poverty and genuine happiness felt like indictment of Elena's own situation, where wealth had purchased everything except what actually mattered. Grace noticed them too, her small sound of recognition pulling Elena's attention to the rearview mirror where her daughter's face was pressed against the window with the same focused intensity she'd displayed watching for the garbage truck. Before Elena could decide whether to stop or continue driving, Marcus glanced up and their eyes met through the Bentley's tinted glass, his expression cycling through surprise and something that might have been embarrassment before settling into the warm smile that seemed to be his default setting. He raised a hand in greeting, and Elena found herself returning the gesture, automatically some social programming overriding her uncertainty about whether this encounter was fortunate coincidence or awkward intrusion into his private life. The moment passed as Elena's vehicle moved forward and left them behind, but she couldn't shake the image of Marcus and Caleb's easy relationship, the visible love between them that existed independent of material comfort or social status. Her phone buzzed with incoming messages from the board members who apparently needed her attention even on Sunday afternoon. But for once, Elena ignored the demands and instead focused on the question of what it meant that a sanitation worker with a fraction of her resources was better at creating home environment where a child could thrive than she'd managed with every advantage money could provide. Monday morning arrived with the weight of decision Elena had been avoiding all weekend. The recognition that she couldn't continue observing Marcus's interactions with Grace from distance without eventually addressing the situation directly. The responsible parental action would be to intervene to explain to this well-meaning stranger that Grace had complex psychological needs that required professional management rather than casual conversations through a gate to establish appropriate boundaries that protected her daughter from potential harm that always lurked in relationships with unknown adults. But the memory of Grace's face lighting up at Marcus's presence warred against that supposed responsibility, and Elena found herself paralyzed between competing imperatives of protection and permission. The solution arrived in form of Maria's gentle suggestion that perhaps Elena might consider being outside when the garbage collector arrived, not to interfere, but simply to observe more closely and introduce herself in context that allowed for adult conversation about Grace's well-being. The idea had merit because it acknowledged Elena's legitimate concerns while avoiding the controlling behavior that would probably drive Marcus away and devastate Grace in the process. So when Monday morning's clock showed 8 o'clock, Elena positioned herself in the front garden, ostensibly checking the roses that were Maria's pride, but actually waiting with heart rate elevated beyond what the minimal physical activity justified. The truck's familiar rumble announced Marcus's arrival before Elena saw the vehicle itself, and she watched Grace emerge from the house with the perfect timing that suggested her daughter had been monitoring from inside. The little girl's joy at seeing Marcus was undisguised, her whole body practically vibrating with excitement that made Elena's chest ache because she couldn't remember the last time Grace had displayed such unfiltered emotion about anything. Marcus's response mirrored her daughter's enthusiasm, and Elena observed their greeting with the analytical attention she usually reserved for board presentations, cataloging every gesture and expression for later examination. The conversation that developed followed the same pattern Elena had witnessed previously, Marcus asking questions that didn't require verbal answers, and Grace responding through nods and gestures that he somehow interpreted with accuracy that suggested genuine attentiveness rather than polite guessing. Elena found herself moving closer without conscious decision drawn by curiosity about what made this dynamic work when so many professional interventions had failed and her presence apparently registered in Marcus's peripheral vision because he glanced up with expression that suggested he'd been expecting this confrontation eventually. "You must be Grace's mother." Marcus stood from his crouch but didn't approach, maintaining respectful distance that acknowledged Elena's authority while not displaying the defensive body language that would have signaled guilt or inappropriate motivation. "I'm Marcus Hayes. I've been enjoying our morning conversations. Grace is a remarkable young lady." The words were simple, and the delivery was genuine, carrying none of the performative charm that Elena had learned to recognize and distrust in business contexts where everyone wanted something, and honesty was liability rather than asset. She found herself wrong-footed by his straightforwardness, The prepared speech about boundaries and appropriate behavior suddenly feeling heavy-handed, given that Marcus hadn't actually done anything wrong beyond being kind to a lonely child. I've noticed Elena kept her voice neutral despite the emotional turbulence underneath. I appreciate your kindness, but I need to understand what's happening here. My daughter has selective mutism, a psychological condition that makes it extremely difficult for her to speak. She's been seeing therapists for 6 years with limited progress, and suddenly she's seeking out daily conversations with someone she doesn't know. I'm sure you can understand why that might concern me. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he was considering his response carefully rather than reacting defensively to what could have been interpreted as accusation. I can understand that completely. If I were in your position, I'd probably be questioning my motivations too. The acknowledgement was disarming in its directness. I don't have any agenda here beyond seeing a sad kid and wanting to help her feel a little less alone. My own son went through something similar after his mother died, spent almost 2 years barely speaking, and I remember how isolating that was for both of us. When I see that same look in Grace's eyes, I recognize it. The mention of his wife's death shifted something in Elena's perception, the recognition that Marcus was operating from his own experience of grief, rather than theoretical understanding, creating unexpected common ground between them. I'm sorry for your loss. The condolence was automatic but sincere. How did you help your son start speaking again? Honestly, Bob, Marcus's smile carried self-deprecating quality that suggested he didn't consider himself expert, deserving of admiration. I stopped trying to fix him. I stopped bringing in therapists and trying different interventions and treating his silence like problem that needed solving. Instead, I just sat with him in it, let him be blacked and scared and angry without demanding that he perform being okay for my benefit. Eventually, he started talking again because he felt safe enough to do it, not because I'd found the right treatment protocol. The observation hit Elena with force that felt physical, the recognition that every expert she'd consulted had offered variations of the same approach: identify the pathology, implement the intervention, measure the progress toward predetermined outcome. None of them had suggested that perhaps Grace's silence was her own valid response to overwhelming loss, rather than dysfunction requiring correction, and the possibility that Elena had been asking the wrong questions for 6 years made her feel simultaneously hopeful and devastated. Before Elena could formulate response, Grace moved between them with the decisive action of someone who'd apparently decided the adults were taking too long to reach the conclusion she'd already arrived at. Her small hand grabbed Marcus's fingers and then reached for Elena's, pulling them together with the clear intention of creating connection that required no words to communicate. The gesture was so unlike Grace's usual passive acceptance of whatever adults decided that Elena stood frozen for a moment, trying to process this unprecedented assertion of will from her daughter. Marcus looked at Elena with expression that was part question and part understanding, waiting for her to either accept or reject what Grace was offering, and Elena found herself taking his hand, despite every rational argument about maintaining appropriate boundaries with strangers. His palm was rough with calluses that spoke to years of physical labor, warm and solid in ways that Elena's world of digital transactions and corporate abstraction had lost contact with, and standing there connected through their daughter felt like participating in something significant, even if Elena couldn't quite articulate what that significance meant. Grace released both their hands and stepped back, nodding with satisfaction that suggested she'd accomplished what she'd set out to do, and Elena watched her daughter pick up the teddy bear and hold it toward Marcus, an offering that clearly meant something, though Elena couldn't interpret the specifics. Marcus crouched again and examined the bear with the same careful attention he'd shown previously, and Elena heard herself asking the question that had been nagging at her since first witnessing their interactions. What do you see when you look at her? The query emerged more vulnerable than Elena had intended, the desperate need of parent who felt like she was failing to understand what others perceived with apparently greater clarity than her own maternal instinct provided. Marcus glanced up at Elena before returning his attention to Grace, his expression thoughtful. I see a kid who's carrying more than she should have, too, who's figured out that staying silent is safer than risking saying the wrong thing and making the people she loves more sad than they already are. I see someone who's protecting everyone around her by keeping her own feelings locked inside, and I see how exhausting that must be. He paused before adding quietly, And I see my son 4 years ago, right after Rachel died, before he understood that grief was something we could share instead of something he had to hide to protect me. The words landed with Elena like diagnosis she'd been waiting for without knowing she needed the realization that Grace's silence might be protection rather than pathology, reframing everything Elena thought she understood about her daughter's condition. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket, the distinctive pattern that indicated Gerald Whitmore was calling, and Elena's chest tightened with the familiar tension that her business partner had been generating lately, with his increasingly aggressive suggestions that she should consider selling the company while its valuation was at peak levels. I have to take this. Elena heard the apology in her own voice, the recognition that she was prioritizing work over this moment that probably mattered more than whatever crisis Gerald had manufactured this time. Thank you for being kind to Grace. I'd like to talk more when I have time that isn't measured in minutes stolen between meetings. Marcus stood and nodded, his expression understanding, rather than judgmental. I'm here every Monday through Friday, 8:15. If you want to continue this conversation, you know where to find me. He turned his attention back to Grace. See you tomorrow, Princess. Tell your bear I said the weather's perfect for adventures today. Grace waved, and Marcus returned to his truck, and Elena watched him drive away, while her phone continued its insistent buzzing. She answered with the clipped efficiency that characterized her professional persona, listening to Gerald's latest concern about quarterly projections, while some part of her consciousness remained focused on the interaction she'd just witnessed and the questions it raised about everything she'd been doing wrong for 6 years. The conversation with Gerald followed predictable pattern, his barely disguised frustration with Elena's refusal to consider the Chinese acquisition offer that would make them both extraordinarily wealthy, but would also mean abandoning Thomas's vision for the company he'd built. Gerald had been pushing this agenda for months now, with increasing intensity, and Elena had been resisting with equal determination, but lately his pressure had taken on quality that felt almost desperate rather than merely ambitious. She made non-committal responses while walking back in her mind only partially engaged with projections and market analysis, because the larger part of her attention remained focused on Grace, who had retreated to the window to watch Marcus's truck disappear down Delancey Street. That evening brought development that would shift Elena's entire understanding of her situation, though she wouldn't recognize its significance until much later. A package arrived by courier marked confidential and personal, addressed to Elena Morrison in hand, that she didn't recognize, and when she opened it in the privacy of her study, the contents made her blood run cold. Inside was single flash drive and a note written in cramped script that she eventually identified as belonging to Kenneth Morrison, the distant relative of Gerald's who'd been driving drunk 6 years ago when his car had struck Thomas's vehicle and killed him instantly. The note was brief and cryptic. I can't live with what I did anymore. This contains the truth about your husband's death. I'm sorry. The flash drive held a single video file that began playing automatically when Elena inserted it into her computer, showing Kenneth Morrison sitting in what appeared to be cheap motel room, his face haggard and his eyes carrying the particular desperation of someone who'd reached the end of whatever rope had been sustaining him. My name is Kenneth Morrison, and I was paid $500,000 by Gerald Whitmore to get drunk and drive my car into Thomas Morrison's vehicle on the night of September 14th, 6 years ago. Kenneth's recorded voice was slurred but intelligible, carrying the weight of confession that had apparently been eating at him for years. He told me it needed to look like accident, that Thomas was going to refuse to sell the company, and Gerald needed him out of the way before the Chinese deal fell through. I thought I was just going to scare him, maybe cause minor accident that would make him reconsider. But Gerald had done something to Thomas's brakes, and when I hit him, the car couldn't stop, and it went off the road and he died, and I've been living with that for 6 years. The video continued for another 5 minutes with Kenneth providing details that Elena's shock-numbed brain struggled to process: bank account numbers and wire transfer records, and the specific instructions Gerald had given him about timing and location that would make the incident look like random tragedy rather than premeditated murder. By the time the recording ended, Elena was shaking with rage so intense it felt like physical illness. The recognition that she'd been working alongside her husband's killer for 6 years, trusting him and seeking his counsel, and allowing him anywhere near Grace, completely recontextualizing every interaction they'd had since Thomas's death. The flash drive contained additional files, financial records, showing payments from offshore accounts Gerald controlled to Kenneth Morrison's bank email exchanges that danced around explicit admission of conspiracy, but strongly implied coordinated action, and most damningly a recorded phone conversation from 3 weeks before Thomas's death, where Gerald discussed with unknown party the problem of Thomas refusing to sell and the need to find permanent solution before the acquisition window closed. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, assembled with the thoroughness of someone who'd been collecting insurance against the day when guilt became unbearable, or when the person who'd orchestrated murder decided that loose ends needed tying off. Elena's first instinct was to call the police immediately to have Gerald arrested before he could destroy evidence or flee to some country without extradition treaty, but training and strategic thinking that had served her well in business asserted itself despite emotional turmoil. Gerald was a powerful man with resources and connections, and moving against him without careful preparation would give him opportunity to mount defense that might result in him escaping justice on technicalities. She needed legal counsel, and she needed to secure the evidence in ways that couldn't be challenged in court. And she needed to do all of this without tipping Gerald off that she knew the truth about Thomas's murder. The rage that burned through Elena's chest felt cleansing in its intensity. Years of grief that had been diffuse and directionless, suddenly having specific target that deserved every ounce of fury she could generate. Gerald had killed Thomas not for personal vendetta, but for money had destroyed Grace's father and Elena's husband and Caleb's world, for the simple reason that Thomas's continued existence was inconvenient to acquisition deal that would make Gerald wealthy beyond even his current substantial means. The casual cruelty of that calculation made Elena want to burn everything down, and only the recognition that Grace needed her mother to be strategic rather than reactive kept Elena from driving to Gerald's house immediately and confronting him with evidence of his crimes. Sleep was impossible that night, Elena's mind racing through scenarios and counter-scenarios, legal strategies and contingency plans, the mechanical analysis that provided anchor against the emotional storm threatening to sweep her away entirely. By dawn, she'd outlined an approach that would secure justice while protecting Grace from the media circuses that would inevitably follow Gerald's arrest, and the first step was consulting with criminal defense attorney who specialized in corporate malfeasance and wouldn't be intimidated by Gerald's connections or resources. The attorney Elena contacted was Rebecca Santos, the woman whose reputation for aggressive advocacy and immunity to pressure had made her simultaneously celebrated and feared in Philadelphia legal circles. Rebecca agreed to emergency meeting that afternoon, and when Elena arrived at the modest offices that suggested competence over pretension, she found a lawyer who listened to the entire story without interruption before reviewing the evidence with the systematic attention of someone who understood that cases were won through preparation rather than courtroom heroics. "This is solid." Rebecca's assessment was delivered with professional detachment that somehow made it more rather than less convincing. Kenneth Morrison's testimony, combined with the financial records and the recorded conversation, gives us enough for criminal prosecution. The question is what you want the outcome to be, because there are multiple paths forward and they lead to very different destinations. Elena leaned forward, her hands gripping the arms of her chair, hard enough that her knuckles showed white. "I want Gerald in prison for the rest of his life. I want him to lose everything the way he took everything from me. I want justice for Thomas and for Grace and for the 6 years we've spent grieving while his killer pretended to be our friend and business partner." Rebecca nodded slowly, making notes on legal pad in front of her. "That's understandable and probably achievable given the evidence, but I need you to consider the cost before we proceed. Gerald will mount aggressive defense, and that will mean dragging Thomas's memory through the mud as his attorneys try to create alternative narratives about the accident. It will mean Grace being exposed to media attention and speculation about her father's death. It will mean the company you've built being associated with murder and conspiracy, which will tank the stock price and potentially destroy everything Thomas worked for." She met Elena's eyes directly. "Sometimes the price of justice is higher than we're prepared to pay, and you need to decide if you're willing to accept those consequences." The question forced Elena to confront exactly what she was risking in pursuit of holding Gerald accountable, and the answer that emerged surprised her with its clarity. "If I don't pursue this, I'm teaching Grace that powerful people can get away with murder as long as they have enough money and connections. I'm telling her that her father's life didn't matter enough to fight for. I'm accepting that there are some injustices too expensive to address. Elena drew breath that felt like it was pulling oxygen from some reserve she hadn't known existed. I can rebuild a company, and I can protect Grace from media exposure, and I can weather whatever financial damage this causes. What I can't do is look my daughter in the eyes and explain why I chose to let her father's killer walk free because it was more convenient than fighting. The decision made, Rebecca began outlining the legal strategy that would maximize their chances of conviction while minimizing collateral damage to Elena and Grace. And by the time their meeting concluded, Elena felt like she'd enlisted in war that would consume the foreseeable future, but which represented the only morally acceptable path forward. She left Rebecca's office with clear action items and timeline for implementation, the same systematic approach to problem solving that had built Morrison Technologies now deployed toward destroying the man who'd killed Thomas, and then pretended to grieve alongside his widow for 6 years. What Elena didn't anticipate was the speed with which Gerald would recognize that his position had become untenable, or the lengths he would go to protect himself once he understood that Elena knew the truth about Thomas's death. Within 48 hours of her meeting with Rebecca, Elena received notification from Child Protective Services that an anonymous complaint had been filed regarding Grace's welfare, specifically questioning Elena's fitness as parent, given her demanding work schedule, and her daughter's ongoing psychological problems that apparently weren't being adequately addressed. The complaint was transparently retaliatory, and almost certainly Gerald's work, but CPS was legally required to investigate regardless of the source's motivation, and suddenly Elena found herself defending her parenting while simultaneously building criminal case against her husband's killer. The investigation was invasive and humiliating, social workers examining every aspect of Elena's relationship with Grace and questioning whether the mansion on Delancey Street was really an environment where a traumatized child could heal, or whether it was simply expensive prison that isolated Grace from normal childhood experiences. Elena submitted to the scrutiny with outward cooperation while internally seething at Gerald's tactics, the recognition that he was willing to weaponize protective services designed to help vulnerable children in order to shield himself from consequences of murder. The CPS worker assigned to their case was professional, but clearly skeptical about whether billionaire CEO could possibly provide adequate parenting given her other obligations, and Elena found herself in the bizarre position of having to prove she loved her daughter to stranger, with clipboard and predetermined assumptions about what motherhood should look like. The CPS investigation consumed Elena's attention in ways that made building a case against Gerald feel almost secondary, the immediate threat to her custody of Grace overriding even her rage about Thomas's murder. The social worker conducting the assessment was named Patricia Chen, a woman in her early 40s whose professional demeanor couldn't quite hide her apparent conviction that wealthy parents were inherently neglectful, regardless of their intentions. She arrived unannounced on Wednesday morning, clipboard in hand, and questions already forming, and Elena found herself explaining her parenting choices to someone who seemed determined to find them inadequate. How many hours per week do you spend directly engaged with Grace? Patricia's pen hovered over her form, waiting to record whatever answer Elena provided, and presumably finding it wanting, not meals or transportation, but actual quality interaction where you're focused on her needs rather than your phone or work obligations. Elena calculated, quickly recognizing that honesty would sound damning, but that lying would be worse if discovered. Between 20 and 30 hours depending on the week. I make breakfast with her most mornings. We have dinner together every night. I'm not traveling, and weekends are reserved for activities she chooses. The number felt substantial when Elena said it aloud, but Patricia's expression suggested she'd heard exactly what she'd expected to hear. And how often are you traveling? Patricia made another note, the scratch of pen on paper somehow conveying judgment that words didn't explicitly state. Grace's school records indicate she's missed several therapy appointments recently. Is that related to your schedule conflicts? The accusation stung because it contained truth that Elena couldn't entirely refute, the recognition that her responsibilities to Morrison Technologies sometimes did create scheduling challenges that affected Grace's treatment. I've never missed an appointment that was critical. Sometimes we've had to reschedule when conflicts arose, but Grace's well-being is always my first priority. The defense sounded weak even to Elena's own ears, the kind of thing someone said when they knew they were failing but couldn't quite admit it directly. Patricia moved through the house with systematic thoroughness, examining Grace's bedroom and the play spaces, and asking questions about daily routines that revealed assumptions about how proper parenting should look. The mansion's very grandeur seemed to count against Elena, the visible wealth suggesting that she was trying to substitute money for genuine maternal presence. And when Patricia asked about Grace's friendships and social connections outside of school, Elena had to admit that her daughter had none, that the selective mutism and Elena's own protective instincts had combined to keep Grace isolated from the kind of ordinary childhood experiences that built resilience and joy. I'd like to interview Grace directly. Patricia's request was delivered as statement, rather than question, the implicit authority of her position, making refusal impossible. Is she available now, or should I return when she's home from school? She's at school. Elena checked her watch, calculating when Grace would return and whether she could prepare her daughter for this interrogation that would probably terrify her into even deeper silence. She'll be home at 3:30. But I should warn you that Grace has selective mutism and won't respond verbally to your questions. It's not defiance, it's a psychological condition that makes speech extremely difficult for her in most situations. Patricia's expression suggested she'd heard this explanation before and remained skeptical about its validity. We'll see. Sometimes children are more forthcoming when they feel safe expressing concerns they've been afraid to voice at home. The implication was clear and infuriating. The suggestion that Grace's silence might reflect fear of her mother rather than trauma from her father's death, and Elena felt rage building in her chest that she forced down through sheer willpower, because displaying anger would only confirm Patricia's apparent preconceptions about her parenting. The interview with Grace that afternoon was exactly as painful as Elena had anticipated, her daughter sitting rigid in the chair, while Patricia asked questions designed to elicit admission of neglect or abuse or whatever specific failing had prompted the anonymous complaint. Grace remained silent throughout, not even nodding or shaking her head in response to yes or no questions, her entire body language screaming discomfort and fear that Patricia apparently interpreted as evidence supporting her suspicions rather than natural response to being interrogated by a stranger. Grace, I'm here to help you. Patricia's voice took on the overly gentle quality that adults used when they thought they were being reassuring, but which actually conveyed condescension that children inevitably recognized. If there's anything happening at home that makes you feel unsafe or scared, you can tell me. Nothing you say will get you in trouble. I promise. The words hung in air while Grace stared at her hands clutching the brown teddy bear with intensity that made her knuckles white, and Elena watched her daughter retreat further into protective silence while being unable to intervene without making the situation worse. After 45 minutes of fruitless questions, Patricia finally accepted that Grace wasn't going to speak and concluded the interview with observations that she recorded in her notes without sharing with Elena. The social worker departed with promise to return for follow-up assessment and reminder that the investigation would continue until CPS was satisfied that Grace's home environment met appropriate standards, and Elena was left standing in her mansion, feeling like she'd failed some fundamental test of motherhood that she hadn't even known she was taking. Grace remained on the couch after Patricia left, her small body curled around the teddy bear in posture that Elena recognized as the particular way her daughter made herself small when the world felt overwhelming. Elena approached slowly, sitting on the opposite end of the couch and trying to find words that would comfort rather than further distress, but everything she considered saying felt inadequate to address what Grace had just experienced. I'm sorry, sweetheart. Elena's voice was quiet, weighted with guilt that felt like physical mass pressing against her chest. I'm sorry that woman scared you. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from having to answer those questions. I'm sorry that people think I'm not taking good enough care of you when the truth is, I don't know how to do better than I'm already trying. Grace lifted her head slightly, those blue eyes meeting Elena's with expression that was hard to interpret, but which seemed to carry more understanding than any 6-year-old should possess. Her daughter shifted position, moving closer and finally leaning against Elena's side in gesture of comfort, seeking that felt simultaneously natural and rare enough to make Elena's throat tight. They sat together in silence that was companionable rather than painful, and Elena found herself remembering what Marcus had said about creating space for feelings to exist without demanding they transform into something more palatable. The following day brought escalation that confirmed Gerald's involvement in the CPS complaint and demonstrated how far he was willing to go to protect himself from prosecution. Elena arrived at Morrison Technologies for an emergency board meeting. She hadn't called, finding Gerald already seated at the head of the conference table, with expression that mixed false concern with barely hidden triumph. The other board members looked uncomfortable, their body language suggesting they'd been presented with information they found troubling, but hadn't yet determined how to address. "Elena, thank you for coming on short notice." Gerald's voice carried the smooth warmth that had always made him effective at manipulation, and Elena felt her hands clench involuntarily at the sound. "We've received some disturbing information that requires immediate discussion. Several board members have expressed concern about your recent behavior and whether you're currently fit to continue as CEO, given the personal challenges you're facing." The attack was brazen in its directness, and Elena recognized immediately that Gerald was attempting to remove her from leadership before she could move against him legally. The board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between loyalty to Elena and whatever narrative Gerald had constructed about her supposed unfitness, and Elena made split-second decision to address the situation head-on rather than allowing Gerald to control the framing. "I appreciate your concern." Elena's voice was ice, every word carefully controlled to convey authority despite the rage burning underneath. "But I'm curious about the timing of these questions about my fitness. They seem to have emerged shortly after I discovered evidence that my husband's death 6 years ago wasn't an accident but was actually premeditated murder orchestrated by someone in this room." The statement landed like explosion, board members' expressions shifting from discomfort to shock, while Gerald's face went through a rapid series of calculations before settling on indignant denial. "That's an outrageous accusation." His voice rose with artificial anger. "I understand you're under stress, Elena, which is exactly why we're concerned about your judgment. Making wild conspiracy theories about Thomas's death suggests you're experiencing some kind of breakdown that requires professional intervention." Elena pulled the flash drive from her bag and held it up. "I have video confession from Kenneth Morrison detailing how you paid him $500,000 to cause the accident that killed Thomas. I have bank records showing the wire transfer from your offshore account. I have recorded phone conversation where you discussed the need to find permanent solution to Thomas's refusal to sell the company." She met Gerald's eyes directly. "The police will be receiving all of this evidence within the hour, along with my attorneys filing for criminal prosecution. So your concern about my fitness is touching, but ultimately irrelevant because you're going to be in custody by end of day." Gerald's mask slipped entirely, his expression cycling through panic and calculation before arriving at cold fury that was probably closer to his authentic self than any emotion Elena had previously seen from him. "You have no idea what you're doing." His voice was quiet but vibrating with barely suppressed rage. "If you pursue this, you'll destroy everything Thomas built. The company's value will tank, shareholders will sue, and Grace will grow up watching her mother dismantle her father's legacy out of misguided need for revenge." The argument was designed to exploit Elena's guilt and protective instincts, but she'd already worked through this exact reasoning with Rebecca and had arrived at an answer that felt morally clear, even if practically difficult. Thomas's legacy isn't a company valuation. It's the principle that people should face consequences for their actions, that murder is an acceptable business strategy, and that our daughter deserves to grow up in a world where justice actually means something. Elena stood gathering her materials. "This meeting is concluded. Those of you who want to remain on the board after Gerald's arrest are welcome to stay. Those who don't can submit resignations effective immediately." She walked out of the conference room with Gerald's shouted threats following her. Something about her living to regret this decision and protecting herself before it was too late. But Elena's attention was already focused on next steps in strategy she and Rebecca had developed. The attorney was waiting in Elena's office, having anticipated that Gerald would attempt some kind of preemptive move, and together they initiated the legal process that would result in arrest warrants, in asset freezes, and the systematic dismantling of Gerald's life in retaliation for what he'd done to Thomas. What Elena didn't anticipate was Gerald's final desperate gambit, the action that would force her to rely on help from the most unexpected source and would demonstrate exactly how far she still had to go in learning to trust people whose value couldn't be measured in credentials or compensation. The threat arrived via text message at 11 p.m. that night sent from burner phone to ensure it couldn't be traced, and the words made Elena's blood run cold with fear that transcended even her rage about Thomas's murder. You think you've won, but you've merely ensured that Grace will experience the same loss you did. Children are so fragile, aren't they? Such easy targets for accidents that look completely unrelated to their parents' choices. Back off or find out exactly how much grief one person can endure. The message was clear threat against Grace's life, and Elena's first instinct was to call the police and demand protection and do everything in her power to ensure her daughter's safety. But Rebecca counseled different approach, pointing out that without proof of who had sent the message, law enforcement would be limited in what they could do, and that Gerald would simply deny any involvement while continuing to pose threat from the shadows. What they needed was to catch him in the act of attempting to harm Grace, and that required setting trap that would expose his intent while keeping Grace actually safe from danger. The plan Rebecca outlined was risky and made Elena's maternal instincts scream in protest, but the logic was sound enough that she couldn't dismiss it entirely. They would let Gerald believe his threat had worked, that Elena was backing down from prosecution in exchange for Grace's safety. This would draw him out of hiding to verify that Elena was actually abandoning her case, and in that moment of exposure, they could gather evidence of his intent that would make conviction even more certain. The strategy required using Grace's bait in carefully controlled way, and everything in Elena recoiled from the idea of putting her daughter at risk, even for strategic advantage. I can't do this. Elena's voice shook despite attempts to control it. I can't use my child as bait to catch her father's murderer. What kind of mother would that make me? Rebecca's expression was sympathetic but firm. The kind of mother who ensures that the man who killed Grace's father and is now threatening her daughter's life doesn't escape justice because you prioritized immediate comfort over long-term safety. Gerald will keep coming after both of you until he's in prison. This is the fastest way to put him there while maintaining enough control to minimize the actual danger to Grace. The argument eventually prevailed through combination of logic and Elena's recognition that her protective instincts, while valid, couldn't be allowed to override strategic thinking when Grace's long-term safety demanded holding Gerald accountable. The plan was implemented the following Monday with precision that made Elena's stomach churn with anxiety she couldn't quite suppress. She sent message to Gerald via intermediary indicating she was willing to negotiate, that she'd been hasty in her accusations, and wanted to discuss settlement that would protect everyone's interests. The bait was transparent enough that Gerald should have been suspicious, but apparently his arrogance convinced him that Elena was genuinely willing to back down to protect Grace. The meeting was scheduled for neutral location coffee shop in Center City, where public visibility would theoretically prevent violence, but which Gerald presumably saw as opportunity to intimidate Elena into permanent silence. What Gerald didn't know was that Rebecca had arranged for undercover police presence and recording equipment that would capture whatever threats or admissions he made during the conversation. Elena arrived early and positioned herself at table with clear sight lines, her phone recording in her pocket, and her hands shaking with adrenaline that made her coffee cup rattle against its saucer. Gerald appeared 15 minutes late, power move designed to establish dominance, and his expression carried smug satisfaction that made Elena want to leap across the table and claw out his eyes. He sat without preamble and leaned forward with the false intimacy of someone who thought he'd already won, and when he spoke, his voice carried oily charm that made Elena's skin crawl with revulsion. I'm glad you've come to your senses. Gerald's tone was patronizing, the verbal equivalent of patting her head like obedient child. Thomas wouldn't have wanted you to destroy everything he built over misguided quest for revenge. We can reach arrangement where everyone walks away with what they need. You keep the company, I get to retire quietly with my reputation intact, and Grace grows up with her mother instead of visiting her in prison after you're prosecuted for making false accusations. The threat was delivered with casual confidence that suggested Gerald genuinely believed he still held all the power, and Elena felt rage surge through her chest with intensity that made coherent speech momentarily difficult. You killed my husband. The words emerged with venom she didn't try to hide. You murdered Thomas in cold blood for money, and now you're threatening our daughter. What kind of arrangement did you think would possibly be acceptable to me? Gerald's expression flickered with annoyance at her continued resistance. I'm offering you your freedom and your child. That should be more than enough. Thomas was going to destroy the opportunity of lifetime because of his sentimental attachment to company. He couldn't even run profitably anymore. I did what was necessary to protect our investors and employees. His death was unfortunate, but ultimately served greater good of preserving jobs and shareholder value. The justification was so morally bankrupt that Elena almost laughed at its audacity, the attempt to reframe murder as noble sacrifice for economic benefit. Before she could respond, Gerald leaned closer and dropped his voice to whisper that the recording equipment would struggle to capture, forcing Elena to strain forward to hear his next words. And if you continue to push this prosecution, Grace will have accident too. Children drown in bathtubs. They fall downstairs. They choke on food while their nannies are distracted. So many tragic ways for little girls to die, and none of them will trace back to me any more than Thomas's accident did. The choice is yours, Elena. Walk away now and raise your daughter, or persist in this foolishness and bury her next to her father. The explicit threat was exactly what Rebecca had predicted Gerald would make once he felt secure in his control of the situation, and Elena knew the recording had captured enough to support additional charges beyond Thomas's murder. She stood abruptly, unable to tolerate his presence for another second, and her movement apparently signaled the undercover officers who'd been positioned throughout the coffee shop because they moved in simultaneously from multiple directions. Gerald Whitmore, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Morrison and for making terroristic threats against Elena Morrison and Grace Morrison. The lead officer was reading Miranda rights while Gerald's face cycled through disbelief and rage, his hands being pulled behind his back and cuffed, while other patrons stared with the fascinated horror that accompanied watching someone else's catastrophe unfold in public space. You're making huge mistake, Gerald's voice rose to shout as he was led toward the exit. I have lawyers who will destroy you. I have connections in this city that will ensure you never work again. You think you've won, but you've just guaranteed your own destruction. Elena watched him being forced into the police car and felt something release in her chest that might have been the beginning of actual relief, the recognition that the man who'd killed Thomas and threatened Grace was finally facing consequences that his wealth and status couldn't deflect. Rebecca appeared at her elbow, having observed the arrest from safe distance, and her expression carried professional satisfaction of lawyer whose strategy had worked exactly as planned. That was extremely dangerous, and you were incredibly brave. Rebecca's tone mixed congratulation with reproof. I hope you'll never agree to anything like this again, because the risk was substantially higher than I let you believe when we were planning it. But we got what we needed. Between the confession about Thomas's murder and the explicit threats against Grace, Gerald won't see freedom again for rest of his life. The words should have brought triumphant satisfaction, but Elena mostly felt exhausted in ways that transcended physical tiredness. The accumulated weight of 6 years of grief and weeks of strategic maneuvering finally catching up with her now that the immediate crisis had passed. She wanted to go home and hold Grace and try to explain that the danger was over. But even thinking about that conversation made Elena's chest tight with recognition of how much her daughter had been exposed to, despite Elena's best efforts at protection. The drive back to Delancey Street took her through West Philadelphia again, the route having become almost habit since that first unplanned detour, and Elena found herself pulling over when she saw a familiar pickup truck parked outside Marcus's building. The impulse to seek comfort from someone who'd somehow become important despite their limited actual interaction was probably indicative of emotional vulnerability that Elena would normally guard against, but normal defenses had been thoroughly demolished by the morning's events, and she found herself knocking on the apartment door before rational consideration could override instinctive need. Marcus answered with an expression that cycled through surprise and concern when he registered Elena's obvious distress, and his first words were about Grace in ways that demonstrated where his priorities naturally settled. Is Grace okay? Did something happen to her? She's fine. Elena's voice cracked despite attempts at control. She's at school and she's safe. I just needed to talk to someone who isn't a lawyer or a board member or someone with agenda about what I should be feeling right now. The admission of vulnerability was foreign to her nature, but Marcus's presence somehow made honesty feel safer than the protective dishonesty she deployed with everyone else. Come in. Marcus stepped back to admit her into the modest apartment, and Elena registered details that spoke to life lived with limited resources but genuine care. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator, and basketball trophies lined a shelf next to books about grief counseling and single parenting. The space was clean, but worn furniture that had seen better decades arranged with attention to function over form, and the contrast with her mansion made Elena acutely aware of how different their circumstances were, despite the common ground of being single parents raising children touched by loss. Caleb's at school, obviously. Marcus gestured toward the couch that had probably been purchased used and had definitely seen hard use since. Can I get you coffee or water or something stronger if you need it? The offer was made without judgment. Simple recognition that sometimes circumstances warranted chemical assistance with emotional regulation. Just coffee. Elena sat and felt the couch cushions compress under her weight in ways her expensive furniture never did, the physical sensation grounding her in present moment. I had a man arrested this morning for murdering my husband 6 years ago. The statement emerged blunt and unadorned, too complex to dress up in euphemism or social pleasantry. Marcus's hand froze in the act of reaching for coffee pot, his whole body going still with the kind of focused attention that suggested he understood the weight of what Elena was saying. The person who killed Thomas wasn't drunk driver having accident. It was business partner who paid someone to make it look accidental so he could take control of our company. I just found out 2 weeks ago. I've been building case to prosecute him while he's been threatening to kill Grace if I don't back down. Jesus. Marcus abandoned the coffee and sat on the couches opposite and maintaining respectful distance while making clear he was fully present for whatever Elena needed to share. That's beyond anything I can even process. How are you functioning right now? How is Grace handling knowing her father was murdered? She doesn't know. Elena felt tears finally spilling over, despite her best efforts to maintain composure. I haven't told her because she's 6 years old and barely speaking, and I can't figure out how to explain that the man who seemed like family friend for past 6 years actually killed her father for money. The weight of that unshared knowledge felt crushing the isolation of carrying truth that Grace deserved to know, but which Elena couldn't figure out how to communicate. Marcus was silent for a moment that stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable before he spoke with the careful consideration that characterized his approach to difficult subjects. When Rachel died, Caleb kept asking if I could have saved her. He was only 5, but he somehow understood that I was EMT and that I'd been there when she was dying. I avoided answering for almost a year because I didn't want to admit that I'd made triage decision to help someone else first, and by the time I got to Rachel, it was too late. The confession was clearly painful for Marcus to share, his voice rough with emotion that time hadn't fully dulled. Eventually, Father O'Brien convinced me that Caleb deserved truth, even if it was hard, that children can handle difficult realities better than adults give them credit for as long as they're not being lied to or patronized. So I told him. I explained exactly what happened and that I lived with guilt every day about the choice I'd made. And you know what he said? Elena shook her head, unable to speak past the constriction in her throat. He said it wasn't my fault because I was trying to help everyone, and sometimes you can't save everybody, no matter how hard you try. Marcus's voice broke slightly, 5 years old, and he had wisdom to forgive me for something I still haven't forgiven myself for. That's when I understood that honesty, even painful honesty, is a gift we owe children because it respects their capacity to understand their own stories. The observation penetrated Elena's defenses with force that made her flinch. The recognition that she'd been withholding truth from Grace, partly to protect her daughter, but largely to protect herself from having to witness Grace's reaction. Before she could respond, the apartment door opened and Caleb entered with the unconcerned energy of 12-year-old returning from school, stopping short when he registered unexpected presence of woman he'd only seen from distance during that brief encounter weeks earlier. Dad Caleb's voice carried question he was too polite to ask directly, and Elena saw Marcus make rapid calculation about how to explain her presence in ways that wouldn't alarm his son. Caleb, this is Elena Morrison. She's Grace's mother. She's having a difficult day and needed someone to talk to, so I invited her in. Is that okay with you? The question was genuine rather than rhetorical. Marcus seeking his son's permission to have guests in their shared space, and Caleb nodded slowly while studying Elena with the frank curiosity that children deployed before learning it was considered rude. You're the lady from Society Hill. Grace talks about you. Well, she doesn't talk exactly, but she draws pictures, and I can tell which one is you because you're always wearing fancy clothes. The observation made Elena smile despite her emotional turmoil, The recognition that Grace apparently thought about her enough to include her in the drawings she shared with Caleb. I hope the pictures are flattering. I'd hate to think I was being represented unfairly in artistic form. Caleb's grin suggested he was warming to her, despite initial wariness. They're okay. You're not as pretty as my mom was in Grace's drawings, but that's probably because Grace never met her, so she has to guess what she looked like based on what I tell her. He delivered this assessment with the brutal honesty that children wielded before social conditioning taught them to soften observations that might wound. I'll accept second place to someone I've never met. Elena felt unexpected lightness in her chest, the simple interaction with Caleb, providing relief from the intensity of the morning's events. Your dad was just helping me work through some complicated feelings about being parent. It's harder than anyone tells you it's going to be, isn't it? Or harder. Caleb flopped onto the couch between Elena and Marcus with the casual physicality of child who was comfortable in his own home. But Dad says the hard stuff is usually the stuff that matters most, so if parenting was easy, it probably wouldn't be worth doing. He grabbed apple from the bowl on the coffee table and bit into it with the unself-conscious appetite of growing boy. Are you going to let Grace come over sometime? She keeps asking me about our apartment, and I keep telling her it's not as fancy as her house, but we have better snacks. The invitation was delivered with such genuine enthusiasm that Elena felt her careful boundaries around Grace's social interactions crumble, laying under the weight of recognition that her daughter needed friends more than she needed protection from ordinary childhood experiences. I think that could probably be arranged. Grace would love to see where you live and meet your bear that Marcus keeps mentioning. It's not really my bear anymore. Caleb shrugged with the studied indifference that 12-year-olds deployed around topics they cared about, but didn't want to admit mattered. I gave him to Grace last week because I figured she needed him more than I do. Bears are better at helping sad little kids than sad middle school kids anyway. The casual generosity of the gesture made Elena's throat tight with emotion she couldn't quite name. The recognition that this child had given up something meaningful because he'd recognized someone else's greater need. You're very kind. The words felt inadequate, but were all Elena could manage without dissolving into tears that wouldn't be fair to inflict on Caleb. The afternoon evolved into unexpected domestic scene, Elena calling Maria to explain she'd be late returning and to ask her to collect Grace from school while Marcus made dinner. That was simple but prepared with care that spoke to feeding people being act of love rather than mere necessity. Caleb regaled them with stories from school that were funny and mundane, and exactly the kind of ordinary childhood content that Grace's life completely lacked, and Elena found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in weeks at his description of the substitute teacher who tried to show them educational video only to accidentally play her personal vacation footage instead. When Elena finally prepared to leave, the sun was setting over West Philadelphia and casting the neighborhood in golden light that momentarily obscured the poverty and made everything look almost beautiful. Marcus walked her to her car, with Caleb trailing behind, and at the door he touched her arm with gentleness that somehow didn't feel inappropriate despite their limited acquaintance. You're going to be okay. Marcus's conviction was absolute in ways Elena couldn't match, but found herself wanting to believe. Gerald is going to prison. Grace is safe, and you're stronger than you think you are. Give yourself permission to feel whatever you need to feel without judging yourself for not being perfect at processing trauma. How did you get so wise about grief? Elena's question was genuine, the recognition that Marcus possessed hard-earned understanding that her wealth couldn't purchase. Practice. His smile was sad but real. Lots and lots of practice at failing and trying again, and learning that healing isn't destination you reach, but process you commit to every single day. Father O'Brien helped, Caleb helped, and honestly helping Grace has helped me remember what it feels like to be useful to someone who's struggling the way I was struggling. The drive home took Elena through darkening streets, the city transitioning from day to night, while she processed everything that had happened in the 16 hours since she'd woken that morning. Gerald's arrest should have felt like victory, but mostly Elena felt exhausted and uncertain about how to move forward now that the immediate crisis had passed. Grace would need to know the truth about her father's death eventually, and that conversation loomed like unavoidable reckoning that Elena had no idea how to approach. What she discovered upon arriving home was that decisions had been made in her absence that would change everything, though she wouldn't understand their significance until much later. Grace was in her room when Elena entered, and Maria met her at the door with expression that mixed concern and something that might have been suppressed excitement. "Senora, something happened while you were gone." Maria kept her voice low, glancing toward the stairs as if worried about being overheard. "Grace asked me for her tablet. She wanted to see her recordings from the cemetery, the ones Dr. Park gave her the recorder for 2 years ago when she was doing therapy." Elena felt her stomach drop, the sudden fear that Gerald's threats, or the CPS investigation or some other trauma, had triggered regression that would undo what limited progress Grace had made. "Is she okay? What did she want with the old recordings?" "I don't know." Maria's expression suggested she was as puzzled as Elena, but she listened to them for almost an hour, and then she asked me to email one of them to your phone. I didn't listen to what was on it because it felt private, but Grace seemed very insistent that you needed to hear it tonight. Elena pulled out her phone and found the email from Maria containing audio file marked simply November 14th and timestamp from 18 months ago. She pressed play while still standing in the entryway, and what she heard made her blood run cold with combination of horror and vindication so intense she had to lean against the wall for support. The recording was Grace's voice, or rather, the voice Grace used when she thought she was alone talking to Thomas's gravestone in the cemetery during one of their Sunday visits. The little girl was telling her father about her week in the halting way children describe their lives. But in the background, Elena could hear other voice adult male, who was apparently also visiting the cemetery and had stopped near Thomas's grave without realizing Grace was there. "I'm sorry, old friend." The voice was unmistakably Gerald, speaking with casual intimacy that suggested he thought he was completely alone. "But business is business, and you were going to refuse the Chinese deal. I couldn't let you destroy the opportunity of lifetime just because you had sentimental attachment to company you couldn't run profitably anymore. Paying Kenneth Morrison to make your accident look convincing was expensive, but it solved the problem permanently." The recording continued with Gerald providing details about the murder that corroborated everything Kenneth Morrison had confessed on his own video, but this version was even more damning because it was Gerald speaking freely without coercion, apparently finding some twisted comfort in confessing to Thomas's corpse while believing no one could hear. Grace's voice had gone silent during Gerald's monologue, and Elena could imagine her daughter frozen in hiding while the man who'd killed her father stood 10 feet away, admitting his crimes. When the recording ended, Elena stood in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what she'd just heard. Grace had been carrying this knowledge for 18 months, had heard Gerald confess to murdering her father, and had kept that information locked inside, along with all the other words she couldn't speak. The weight of that burden for a 6-year-old was incomprehensible, and Elena felt simultaneous gratitude that the recording existed and devastating guilt that Grace had been forced to bear this knowledge alone. She found her daughter in her bedroom, sitting on the bed with the teddy bear in her lap, an expression that was simultaneously fearful and hopeful, as if Grace wasn't certain whether she'd done the right thing by sharing the recording, but desperately wanted her mother's approval. Elena crossed the room and gathered Grace into her arms with fierce protectiveness that had probably been absent too often, but which poured out now without reservation. "You are so brave, my love." Elena's voice broke on the words, tears streaming freely down her face. "So incredibly brave to carry this alone for so long, and to know exactly when to share it. You've helped put the man who hurt Daddy in prison forever. The bad man can never hurt anyone again because of what you did." Grace's small hand reached up to touch Elena's wet cheek, and then her daughter spoke for the first time since that morning weeks ago when she'd said, "Sad to Marcus. Daddy proud." Grace's voice was barely above whisper, but perfectly clear. "Mommy brave too. We brave together." The words shattered what remained of Elena's composure, and she held her daughter while they both cried with the particular intensity that came from releasing emotions too long suppressed. When they'd both calmed enough to speak, Grace pulled back and looked at her mother with eyes that seemed older than 6 years should allow. "Marcus says bears keep words safe until ready." Grace's voice was still soft, but growing stronger with use. "Grace kept Daddy's words safe until ready to help Mommy. Is that okay?" "More than okay, sweetheart." Elena smoothed Grace's hair back from her forehead with gentle touch. "You did exactly the right thing at exactly the right time. That's called wisdom, and most adults never learn it. But apparently my 6-year-old daughter is smarter than all of us. The aftermath of Gerald's arrest and the revelation of Grace's recording unfolded with the bureaucratic slowness that characterized legal proceedings, weeks of depositions and evidence review, and strategic maneuvering by lawyers on both sides. But the outcome was never really in doubt, given the comprehensive nature of the evidence, and 3 months after his arrest, Gerald Whitmore pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and terroristic threats in exchange for a life sentence without possibility of parole, instead of facing trial that might have resulted in death penalty. The sentencing hearing brought closure of sorts, Elena sitting in the courtroom with Rebecca on one side and Marcus on the other, the latter having somehow become fixture in her life despite the continued strangeness of their unlikely friendship. The judge's words about justice and accountability washed over Elena. While she thought about Thomas and everything he'd missed in the 6 years since his murder, Grace's first day of school and her 7th birthday, and all the small moments that accumulated into a life that Gerald had stolen for nothing more meaningful than corporate acquisition that had ultimately fallen through anyway. Outside the courthouse after sentencing, media had assembled for statements neither Elena nor Gerald wanted to provide, but couldn't avoid without ceding narrative control. Gerald's attorney delivered prepared remarks about appeals and miscarriage of justice, but Gerald himself was led away in chains while shouting threats that no longer carried any weight given his permanent removal from society. Elena's statement was brief and focused on Grace, the recognition that her daughter deserved to grow up knowing that truth and justice still mattered even when they came at high cost. Thomas Morrison was a good man who built company based on integrity and innovation. Elena's voice was steady despite the emotion underneath. Gerald Whitmore murdered him to steal what Thomas had created, and in doing so, he didn't just take my husband's life. He stole my daughter's father and attempted to corrupt everything Thomas stood for. The guilty verdict and life sentence don't bring Thomas back, but they prove that some crimes are too fundamental to be dismissed or excused regardless of the perpetrator's wealth or connections. Marcus stood slightly behind her during the statement present, but not intrusive. And when Elena finished speaking and reporters started shouting questions, she turned to him with expression that was part gratitude and part something more complicated that she wasn't ready to examine closely. He offered his arm and they walked together toward her car, while cameras flashed and journalists speculated about the nature of their relationship, and Elena found that she didn't particularly care what conclusions strangers drew, as long as the people who actually mattered understood the truth. The months that followed Gerald's sentencing brought healing that was gradual and nonlinear progress, mixed with setbacks in ways that Marcus had warned her to expect. Grace spoke more, but still had days when silence felt safer, and Elena learned to accept that recovery wasn't straight line from trauma to wholeness, but rather complicated journey with its own rhythm that couldn't be forced. The CPS investigation was quietly closed after Patricia Chen's submitted report acknowledging that while Elena's parenting wasn't perfect, Grace was clearly loved and adequately cared for in an environment that met all legal standards. Morrison Technologies stabilized under Elena's continued leadership, the board having purged Gerald's allies and committed to running the company according to principles Thomas had established rather than purely for shareholder value. The Chinese acquisition offer had expired and been replaced by organic growth strategy that was slower but more sustainable, and Elena found satisfaction in building something that honored her late husband's vision, even if it meant sacrificing some of the aggressive expansion that Gerald had pushed for. But the most significant change was the relationship that developed between Elena's household and Marcus's two families, that had been brought together by chance and trauma, finding genuine connection that transcended their vastly different circumstances. Weekly dinners became routine, but alternating between the mansion and the apartment, and Caleb and Grace developed the kind of sibling relationship that was equal parts affection and mild antagonism. Marcus taught Grace about basketball and patience, while Elena found herself learning from Caleb about resilience and the particular wisdom that came from surviving loss at young age. The question of whether Elena and Marcus's relationship would evolve into romance remained unresolved and largely unaddressed, both of them apparently content to let connection develop at its own pace without forcing it into conventional categories. They were family in ways that mattered more than labels, connected through their children and their shared understanding of grief, and their commitment to supporting each other through the ongoing work of healing. Some evenings, Elena caught Marcus watching her with expression that suggested he felt more than friendship, And she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she felt the same pull towards something deeper, but the timing never felt quite right for conversation that would change the nature of what they'd built. 8 months after Gerald's sentencing, Grace's school announced its annual talent show, and to everyone's surprise, Grace volunteered to participate. Elena's first instinct was panic, the fear that public performance would overwhelm her daughter and trigger regression. But Marcus's gentle counsel about trusting Grace's judgment overrode her protective instincts. The night of the talent show arrived with Elena's stomach churning with anxiety, while Grace seemed remarkably calm, clutching her teddy bear backstage and waiting for her name to be called. The auditorium was packed with parents and teachers and students, Society Hill elite in attendance, along with families from less privileged backgrounds whose children attended on scholarship. Elena sat in the front row with Marcus and Caleb, her hands gripping the armrests hard enough to hurt, while her heart hammered against her ribs. When Grace's name was announced and her daughter walked onto the stage, the silence that fell over the audience felt charged with collective awareness that something significant was about to happen. Grace stood at the microphone looking impossibly small, her 6-year-old frame dwarfed by the stage's dimensions. And for 30 seconds, she didn't speak while the audience waited with the kind of suspended anticipation that preceded either triumph or disaster. Elena started to rise from her seat, convinced her daughter was frozen and needed rescue. But Marcus's hand on her arm stopped her with gentle insistence that they should wait and trust. "My name is Grace Morrison." Her daughter's voice was quiet but clear, amplified by the microphone into words that reached every corner of the auditorium. "I was quiet for 6 years because I was sad. When my daddy died, I stopped talking because if I talked, I might cry, and if I cried, Mommy would be sadder. I thought if I was quiet, I could keep all the sad inside, but sad doesn't go away. When you're quiet, it just gets bigger until one day a man with a garbage truck gave me back my teddy bear." The audience was completely silent now, riveted by the small child describing her journey with honesty that adults rarely achieved. Grace continued, her voice growing stronger with each sentence as she explained how Marcus had been the first person who didn't try to make her talk, who had simply listened and accepted her silence as valid communication rather than problem requiring solution. She talked about learning that being sad was okay, that it meant you'd love someone, and that love didn't disappear when people died, but changed shape into something you carried forward. "I have new family now." Grace pointed to where Elena, Marcus, and Caleb sat together. "They didn't replace Daddy because nobody can replace Daddy, but they taught me that love doesn't run out. You can love people who are gone and people who are here, and that's okay." Her final words were delivered directly to Elena. "And I learned that being perfect isn't being good mom. Being present is. Thank you, Mommy, for learning to listen." The standing ovation was instantaneous and sustained the entire auditorium on their feet, while Grace stood on stage looking simultaneously proud and overwhelmed by the response to her courage. Elena was crying openly, as were most of the parents in attendance, and when Grace ran off stage into her mother's arms, the embrace felt like coming home after long exile, the connection between them finally freed from the barriers that grief and guilt had constructed. In the weeks following Grace's speech, something shifted in the broader community's perception of both Elena and Marcus, the recognition that their unlikely alliance represented something valuable about transcending class divisions and preconceptions. The principal approached Elena about establishing fund to provide therapy support for children with selective mutism, an initiative that would be named in Grace's honor, in which Elena immediately committed substantial resources toward creating. Marcus was invited to speak at schools about single parenting and resilience, and while he was initially uncomfortable with the attention, he eventually accepted that his story might help other people struggling with similar challenges. 1 year after Gerald's sentencing, Elena and Marcus stood together in St. Peter's Cemetery beside Thomas's grave during the memorial visit that had become their shared ritual. Grace and Caleb played nearby, the two children comfortable enough with death to treat the cemetery as space for both remembrance and ordinary childhood activity. The headstone bore new inscription that Elena had commissioned, words that attempted to capture who Thomas had been and what he'd valued beyond the corporate achievements that had defined his obituary. "He would have liked you." Elena spoke quietly, aware that this observation carried implications about her feelings that she'd been avoiding examining too closely. Thomas always said that character revealed itself in how people treated those who couldn't benefit them, and you've been kinder to Grace than people who stood to gain substantially from our friendship." Marcus was silent for a moment before responding, his own gaze fixed on the headstone. "I keep thinking about what Father O'Brien said when Rachel died about how God doesn't waste suffering, but transforms it into something that serves others. I didn't believe him then because the pain felt too big to serve any purpose, but watching Grace heal and seeing you find your strength, and having Caleb gain basically a sister through all of this, I'm starting to think maybe he was right." The observation hung in the air between them. Acknowledgement of the strange alchemy that had transformed multiple tragedies into something that resembled hope, and Elena found herself reaching for Marcus's hand with decision that felt simultaneously momentous and completely natural. He accepted her touch without hesitation, his fingers warm and solid in ways that reminded her that isolation was choice rather than inevitability. And they stood together while the autumn sun cast long shadows across the graves of people who'd been loved and lost, but whose influence continued shaping the living who remembered them. 5 years later, the Morrison Hayes household occupied modest home and neighborhood that split the difference between Society Hill's wealth and West Philadelphia's struggle, the deliberate choice to build life that reflected their combined values rather than either person's previous existence. Elena had stepped back from daily operations of Morrison Technologies to focus on the foundation she'd established in Thomas's name, work that felt more meaningful than corporate strategy ever had. Marcus continued with the sanitation department, but had added teaching responsibilities at community college, sharing hard-earned wisdom about resilience with students who needed to hear that their circumstances didn't define their possibilities. Grace at 11 was thriving in ways that would have seemed impossible during those silent years, her voice now used freely to advocate for other children struggling with trauma and selective mutism. She volunteered at Children's Hospital alongside Caleb, the two of them deploying teddy bears and Marcus's listening techniques to help kids who were where Grace had been 6 years earlier. The transformation from victim to healer was complete in ways that made Elena's chest tight with pride every time she watched her daughter connect with struggling child and demonstrate through her own recovery that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. The Christmas morning of that 5th year brought them all together around a tree that was decorated with ornaments from both families, Marcus and Rachel's collection, mixed with items Thomas had chosen, the physical manifestation of how their separate griefs had been woven into shared future. Grace sat on the floor opening presents while Caleb lounged on the couch providing running commentary, and Elena found herself standing in the kitchen doorway watching them with Marcus beside her. Both parents momentarily separate from the children's excitement to appreciate what they'd built together. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Marcus spoke quietly, not wanting to disturb the moment, but apparently needing to share the observation. "That morning 6 years ago when I found Grace's teddy bear in the trash. If I'd just thrown it away without checking, and if I'd been running late and hadn't had time to talk to her, none of this happens. We'd all still be struggling alone instead of struggling together." Elena considered this alternate history where their paths never crossed and felt genuine gratitude that chance had operated in their favor. "I don't think it was chance." The assertion surprised her because Elena had never been particularly religious or mystical, but something about their story felt too perfectly orchestrated to dismiss as random coincidence. Thomas used to say that the universe conspires to help people who are brave enough to stay open to possibility. Maybe Grace keeping that recording and sharing it exactly when needed wasn't strategy so much as trust that things would work out if she did the right thing. The philosophy felt naive, stated aloud, the kind of optimistic thinking that Elena's business training had taught her to dismiss as wishful fantasy, but Marcus nodded with understanding that suggested he'd arrived at similar conclusions through his own journey. "Father O'Brien calls it grace, which I always thought was funny, given your daughter's name. The idea that sometimes we receive gifts we don't deserve and didn't earn, but which change everything anyway." They stood together in companionable silence, while Grace and Caleb's laughter filled the house, and Elena found herself thinking about the garbage man who'd shown up at exactly the right moment to help a sad little girl and had somehow ended up becoming the center around which her entire life reorganized itself. The story shouldn't have worked, the class divide and different backgrounds and simple improbability of it all, arguing against the possibility of lasting connection. But somehow they'd built something real from components that looked incompatible on paper, but fit together perfectly in practice. Grace appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding wrapped box that Elena didn't recognize. From the presents she'd purchased, her daughter's expression, suggesting this was something significant that required adult attention. "This is from me and Caleb. We made it together. You both have to open it at same time." The box contained scrapbook that the children had apparently been working on for months, filled with photographs and drawings and written reflections about their combined family's journey from separate grieving households to integrated unit that functioned despite, or perhaps because of its unconventional structure. The title page read, "From Silence to Song Our Story," in Grace's careful handwriting, and turning the pages revealed narrative told from children's perspective about how love multiplied rather than divided when people were brave enough to stay open to connection. The final page held a photograph that someone had taken without Elena's knowledge, showing her and Marcus and Grace and Caleb standing together at Thomas's grave during one of their memorial visits. Beneath the image, Grace had written in her developing script, "Family isn't where you're born, it's where you choose to belong. We chose each other, and that makes us real." Elena felt tears streaming down her face while Marcus cleared his throat roughly beside her, both of them undone by the simple wisdom of children who'd somehow understood before the adults did that they'd built something worth celebrating, despite the grief that had brought them together. Grace and Caleb watched their parents with the satisfied expressions of people who'd successfully executed surprise, and then Caleb spoke with the studied casualness that suggested he was delivering message they'd rehearsed. "We were thinking," Grace started, her voice still soft but carrying conviction that left no room for argument, "that maybe it's time to stop calling this temporary and start calling it what it is," which is what sweetheart Elena managed to ask despite the emotion constricting her throat. "Home," Caleb finished. "This is our home, and you're our parents, and we're siblings even though we don't share blood. So maybe you two should stop dancing around whatever it is you're doing and just admit you love each other so we can all move forward honestly." The observation was delivered with 12 and 11-year-old directness that made pretending impossible, and Elena found herself laughing through her tears at being called out by children who'd apparently been more perceptive about the adults' feelings than the adults themselves had been. She looked at Marcus and saw her own surprise and amusement reflected in his expression, and in that moment the question that had been hanging between them for 5 years finally demanded answer that couldn't be deferred any longer. "I do love you." Elena spoke the words to Marcus, while the children watched with unconcealed satisfaction at having forced the confession. "I think I've loved you since that first morning when you gave Grace back her bear and somehow gave both of us hope that things could be different. I was just too scared and too proud and too convinced that people from different worlds couldn't build real connection to admit it." Marcus's response was to close the distance between them and kiss her with gentleness that somehow didn't diminish the intensity of emotion underneath, and Grace and Caleb cheered with unself-conscious enthusiasm that suggested they'd been waiting for this development longer than was probably appropriate for children to be invested in their parents' romantic life. When Elena and Marcus finally separated, both breathing slightly harder than the kiss alone warranted, Grace was holding her phone with the expression that suggested she'd been documenting the moment for the scrapbook. Grace's explanation was matter of fact. 20 years from now, you're going to want proof that we had to force you two to stop being stubborn and admit what everyone else already knew." The Christmas that had begun with presents and ordinary celebration transformed into something more significant, the day when two families officially acknowledged that they'd already become one, and that the grief that had brought them together had been alchemized into something beautiful and unexpected. They spent the rest of the day together in the casual intimacy of people who'd stopped performing their lives and started simply living them. And when evening came and Grace asked Elena to tell the story of how their family had formed, Elena found that she could finally narrate their history without drowning in the sadness that had once defined it. "Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lost her voice when she lost her father, and she stayed silent for 6 years because the sadness felt too big to share." Elena spoke while Grace leaned against her, and Caleb and Marcus listened from the couch. "But one morning, a man who collected garbage found her teddy bear mixed in with things people were throwing away, and he gave it back to her because he understood that sometimes the things other people considered trash were actually treasures if you knew how to look carefully enough." The story continued from there, simplified and sanitized for child-appropriate telling, but maintaining the essential truth that their family had been built from broken pieces that somehow fit together more beautifully than wholeness ever could have achieved. When Elena reached the end of the narrative in Grace's speech at the talent show, her daughter interrupted with observation that suggested she'd been thinking about their history from angles Elena hadn't considered. But Mommy, the story doesn't end with my speech. Grace's voice carried the particular certainty of a child who'd figured out something important. That's just when everyone else understood what was happening. The real story is everything that came after all the days when we chose to keep being family, even when it was hard. The wisdom in that observation was profound enough to silence the adults momentarily, the recognition that Grace had understood something fundamental about the nature of commitment and love that many people never quite grasped. Marcus recovered first, reaching over to ruffle Grace's hair with affection that was casual because it was genuine. You're absolutely right, Princess. The best part of any story is what happens after the dramatic moments pass, and people have to figure out how to live with the choices they've made. That's where the real character shows itself. And we have really good character. Caleb's contribution was delivered with confidence that suggested he'd never questioned their family's worth, despite its unconventional structure. We're not perfect, but we're honest, and we show up for each other, and we don't give up when things get hard. That's better than most families manage, even when they do everything the traditional way. The Christmas evening dissolved into comfortable domesticity, dishes being washed, and games being played, and the ordinary rhythms that marked family life when performance had been replaced by authentic presence. Later, after the children had finally been convinced to go to bed despite their protests that Christmas should last forever, Elena and Marcus sat together on the couch in the living room that bore equal traces of both their histories, ornaments from Thomas and Rachel, mixed with new purchases that represented their combined future. I keep waiting for it to feel wrong. Elena spoke quietly, her head resting on Marcus's shoulder in posture that had become natural over the past 5 years. Thomas was my great love, the person I thought I'd spend my entire life with, and logically, I should feel guilty about loving you. But I don't. Somehow, this feels like honoring his memory rather than betraying it. Marcus's arm tightened around her shoulders, his own voice reflective. Father O'Brien told me once that love isn't finite resource that runs out when you give it to multiple people. It's renewable energy that grows stronger the more you use it. Thomas didn't stop being important to you because I'm here now. Rachel didn't stop mattering to me because I love you. The grief we carry is proof that we're capable of loving deeply and that capacity doesn't diminish just because we choose to love again. The observation felt true in ways that gave Elena permission to fully embrace what they'd built without constantly checking over her shoulder for ghosts that would judge her choices. She thought about the 6-year-old who'd stood at the gate waiting for a garbage truck, and the mother who'd watched from her window while her entire understanding of possibility transformed, and she recognized that sometimes the most important changes began with smallest gestures of unexpected kindness that created ripples extending far beyond their initial impact. Outside the window, Philadelphia slept beneath winter stars, the city indifferent to their small domestic happiness, but containing it nonetheless. And somewhere in that vast urban landscape were other people struggling with losses they thought would never heal, and isolation they assumed was permanent. Elena hoped that their story might eventually reach some of those people, that the knowledge that healing was possible, even when it seemed impossible, might provide comfort to someone who needed to hear it, but mostly she focused on the present moment and the particular grace of having built something beautiful from the ruins of what had been destroyed. The future remained uncertain in all the ways that futures always were, but Elena had learned through experience that uncertainty wasn't the same as hopelessness, and that sometimes not knowing exactly where you were going was liberating rather than terrifying if you trusted the people walking beside you. She had Grace and Marcus and Caleb, a family assembled from grief and chance, and the deliberate choice to keep showing up for each other even when easier options presented themselves, and that felt like enough foundation to build whatever came next. In her bedroom, Grace slept peacefully with Daddy Bear beside her, the silent witness to 6 years of grief and the catalyst for everything that had followed. The bear had held her words when she couldn't speak them and had given them back at exactly the right moment, proving that sometimes the most important things we carry are the feelings we're not yet ready to share, but which wait patiently for the day when we're finally brave enough to let them into the light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in ordinary moments and the ongoing work of being family to people who needed you. But tonight there was just silence and satisfaction in the recognition that love, when given freely and accepted gracefully, had power to transform even the most unlikely circumstances into something resembling home.